For the ones who do the true thing in the dark. Part 1. The listing. Chapter 1. Walkthrough. The house on Belclare wanted the wife. Martin Vance knew it the way he knew everything about houses, which is to say completely and without explanation, the knowledge arriving fully furnished like the model homes he'd cut his teeth on in the 90s. The husband had the checkbook and the opinions. He'd said bones twice already, said good bones the way men say it when they want you to know they watch the renovation shows, but the house had no interest in him. The house had chosen the wife the moment she stepped into the entry and stopped talking. Houses always knew. Buyers thought they were shopping. They were auditioning. Original moldings, the husband said, in the dining room, tapping crown like a melon. 1952, Martin said. Plaster, not MDF. You can't get this profile anymore. The mill that cut it closed in 78. He didn't know how he knew that. He had stopped, years ago, asking how he knew things about millwork and load paths and which corner of a foundation had been poured on a Friday. The knowledge was simply there, shelved and dusted, in some room of himself he'd never personally visited. His broker called it the Vance Voodoo and put it on a coffee mug one Christmas. 22 years in residential real estate and the Voodoo had paid for 2 cars, 1 divorce, and a townhouse in Lake Highlands that he had chosen, with deliberate spite toward his own gift, because it wanted nothing from anybody. The wife had drifted to the back of the house. He let the husband orbit the kitchen island. Men needed a few minutes alone with an island. It was like watering at a trough, and followed her. She was standing in the smallest bedroom, the one the listing called an office and the floor plan called nothing at all, a room the size of a held breath. Western exposure. At this hour the light came through the single window in a long amber plank and laid itself across the oak like it was being put to bed. "This is silly," the wife said, not turning around. "It's the smallest room in the house." "It's the best room in the house," Martin said. "It's a closet with a window. Stand there." He pointed to a spot on the floor, 2 feet off center, an unremarkable patch of oak. He could not have told her why that spot. The spot announced itself the way the molding's biography had announced itself. She gave him the look buyers gave him, the look that decided whether he was a salesman or something else, and then she stood where he pointed. The light took her. That was the only way to say it. The amber plank climbed her shoulder and the small room rearranged its proportions around her body the way a sentence rearranges itself around the right word, and Martin watched a woman discover she had been homesick her whole life for a room she'd never stood in. "Oh," she said. "Yeah," Martin said. They wrote the offer that night, over asking, conventional, 14-day close. The husband would tell people at parties for years about the bones. The wife would put a chair in the small room and never tell anyone what she did in it, which was nothing, which was the point. Martin drove home with the radio off. This was the part of the job nobody understood, the part he could not have put in a listing or on a mug. A house was a record. People thought walls were privacy, but walls were testimony. Every house he had ever walked into was busy saying what it was, what had been argued in it, repaired in it, conceived and grieved and gotten over in it, saying it constantly, in joists and settling cracks and the particular way a door swelled in August, and the saying never lied, because a house had no way to lie. Wood couldn't editorialize. A foundation couldn't flatter you. He had spent 22 years as a translator for the only honest witnesses in Texas, and the commission checks were nice, and some nights, alone in the townhouse that asked him for nothing, the loneliness of being the only one who heard them stood on his chest like water. He was 48. He had been married once, to a woman named Renata who used to watch him sleep with an expression he was never awake to see. He had a son he had met a handful of times, a boy raised 200 miles away by Renata's parents, a boy who had grown up into, of course he'd looked, everyone's life was searchable now, into somebody. A face on the internet with 2 million subscribers and his mother's mouth and a way of looking into a camera that made you feel caught. Martin had watched 11 minutes of one video, something about machines and old gods, and closed the laptop with his heart going like a man on a ladder feeling it tip. That had been a year ago. He hadn't looked again. At the light on Mockingbird, with no decision he could point to afterward, he turned west instead of north. Providence Loop ran out where the suburbs gave up, a county road that curled through live oak and limestone shelf like something written in cursive. He knew the route the way his tongue knew his teeth. 19 years he had held the listing at the end of it. 19 years, 4 brokerages, a market crash, a pandemic, and not one price reduction, because reducing it had simply never been possible, in the way that some sentences cannot be said in certain rooms. Other agents assumed the seller was a crank. The seller was a trust with the law firm for a face, and the law firm's instructions, renewed annually, were one line: maintain the listing. The commission on a sale would have been the largest of his career. He had stopped imagining the sale around year 6. The house stood at 234, on 10 acres, behind a gate that was never locked because it didn't need to be. Hill country limestone, 2 stories and a third that was somehow neither attic nor floor, a row off line that resolved differently depending on where you parked. It photographed beautifully and the photographs were all subtly wrong, the way photographs of a face you love are wrong. In 19 years he had shown it maybe 40 times. Buyers walked its halls going quiet in stages, and at some point each of them, everyone, had turned to Martin with an expression that wasn't dislike. Nobody disliked the house, and said some version of the same thing: it's not for us. And it wasn't. He always agreed. It wasn't for them. He parked in the white gravel and didn't get out. Evening was coming down through the live oaks in long ladders. The house held the last of the light along its western face, in a way he had tried for 19 years not to find familiar, and said what it always said, which was nothing, which was the loudest nothing in his life. Every house he'd ever entered testified. This one kept counsel. It was the only building he had ever met that was waiting, patiently, the way stone is patient, and he had never once let himself finish the thought about what it might be waiting for, because the thought had no floor under it, and a man his age learned not to step out into rooms with no floor. His phone buzzed against the console. He looked at the screen for a long time. The gravel ticked as it cooled. Somewhere behind the house, doves were sorting out the evening. The message had come through the contact form on his work site, where it sat now between a cash buyer from Plano and a Zillow notification, dressed as business like everything important he'd ever gotten. From Eli Race. Subject: looking for some history. &GT. Asterisk Mr. Vance, I don't know if this name means anything to you. I'm doing some research into my family on my father's side, and I keep coming up empty before 2002, which I'm told is unusual. I think you might be able to help me with the gaps. I can come to Dallas. I'd rather do this in person, if you're willing. Asterisk. &GT. Asterisk I'm not looking for anything from you. Just history. Asterisk. &GT. Asterisk. Asterisk. Martin read it 4 times. The light let go of the house's western face one course of stone at a time, the way a hand lets go finger by finger. I'm not looking for anything from you. 23 years old and already a liar, Martin thought, with something rising in him that he could not afford to name yet, because everyone alive, was looking for something, and history was never just history. He knew that the way he knew houses. What he did not know, sitting in the white gravel in the failing light with his thumb over the reply field, was why the house at 234 Providence Loop chose that moment, for the first time in 19 years, to turn its porch light on. The bulb in that fixture was older than the listing. He'd noted it at the inspection, 2 decades and another man ago, in handwriting he no longer recognized as his original fixture, leave as is, and in 19 years of showings he had never once seen it lit. Martin Vance typed, "Of course I remember you." He sat with that for a while. Then he deleted it, because it wasn't true, and wrote the true thing instead, the thing that would bring his son to him and end the world that deserved ending. "I'll help if I can. But I should tell you up front, my history has gaps I've never been able to explain either. Maybe we can compare notes." He hit send. Behind him, 10 acres away and watching, the house let its light go out. Chapter 2, The Anomaly. The thing nobody told you about going viral was that it was the easiest thing he had ever done and he had no idea how he'd done it, which meant he had no idea how to do it again, which was the entire problem of his life at 23. Eli Reyes sat in the second bedroom of an apartment in Echo Park that he could afford only because of a number, 2,340,000, that lived in the corner of a dashboard and did not feel like it had anything to do with him. The bedroom was his studio. Acoustic foam, a key light he never turned on anymore, a wall of pinboard where 2 years ago he had mapped the entire God protocol with red string like a maniac in the movie about a maniac. The string was still up. He kept meaning to take it down. Taking it down felt like admitting something. The God Protocol. 6 episodes, junior year, made for nothing in this exact room while he should have been studying for genetics quiz. The premise had been almost a joke when he pitched it to the 400 subscribers he'd had then. Feed the large language models the right prompts and they would generate occult material, invocations, cosmologies, divine names. That was too coherent. Not coherent like a person being spooky. Coherent like a translation. He'd brought on a Coptic scholar who went pale on camera. He'd brought on a folklorist who said, carefully, that the models were producing structural features of magical grammar that no surviving human tradition still had intact, as if they were reconstructing a parent language from its children, the way linguists rebuild Proto-Indo-European from the words it had left behind. That was the episode. Episode 3, The Parent Language. 8 million views in a week. The channel went from 400 to 400,000 while he was taking a midterm. By the time he graduated, Apocrypha was a name, he was a face, and a management agency in Century City was sending him fruit baskets and contracts, and he had learned the central lie of his industry, which was that everyone pretended the success was earned and skillful and repeatable, and nobody admitted that it had mostly just happened to you, like weather, like grace, like being struck. He'd taken the sabbatical to figure out the next thing before the agency figured it out for him. The next thing was supposed to be small. He had a degree in genetic biology and a personal account at one of the consumer sequencing outfits, a perk. They'd sent him a kit hoping he'd talk about it. He never had, and one slow Tuesday in the dead middle of the sabbatical he had pulled his own whole genome data into the analysis pipeline he'd built for an undergrad project, just to play, just to procrastinate, the way other people reorganized a closet. Run the ancestry. Look at the deep history. He was a kid raised by his grandparents who had never met most of his own blood. The lineage dive was half curiosity and half the old ache, the one that lived under everything, the one his whole loud public life was arguably just a way of not feeling. The maternal side came back clean and ordinary and richly documented. Reyes, Tovar, 3 generations in South Texas, a great-grandmother in Coahuila. He felt the small warm click of belonging and moved the cursor to the paternal contribution. The pipeline threw an error. Not a real error. The sequence was fine, the reads were clean, the coverage was good. The error was downstream, in the annotation step, the part that took a stretch of his DNA and asked the world's databases, what is this, where else does this occur, what does it do? For most of his genome the answer came back instantly and boringly, this is a gene you share with 3 billion living people and a banana. But for a set of long stretches on the paternal side, non-coding, the kind of sequence the old textbooks had dismissed as junk, the annotation step returned nothing. Not novel mutation. Not rare variant. Nothing. No match in any reference genome, any population panel, any ancient DNA set, any primate, any vertebrate, any living thing that had ever been sequenced and uploaded by anyone. The stretches were long, and they were structured, too structured, regular in a way that random sequence is never regular, regular the way the occult outputs had been regular, regular the way a sentence is regular. And they did not exist anywhere in the recorded history of life on Earth except inside him. Eli had sat very still for a while. Then he'd run it again on a different machine. Then he'd anonymized it and posted the stretches to 2 forums under a throwaway name, framing it as a homework question. Anybody recognize this assembly artifact? And a population geneticist at Davis had replied within the hour, that's not an artifact. Where did you get this? And then, an hour after that, had messaged him privately, seriously. Where? He had not answered. Because there was only one place it could have come from, and the place had a name, and the name was a man, and the man was a stranger. Now it was 11 at night, and Eli had the draft open again. The email to his father. He'd written it 11 times over 3 weeks. The versions ranged from cold to colder. Mr. Vance, my name is Eli Reyes, and I believe you are my biological father. Too much, too soon. It made it a confrontation. Hi, this is Eli, Renata's son. I had some questions about the family. Too soft, too much like a boy. He had built an entire career on knowing exactly what to say into the silence to make a stranger lean forward, and he could not write 4 sentences to the one stranger who shared the thing in him that the databases couldn't name. What he kept circling was the verb help. He could not stand to ask his father for anything. He had spent a childhood not asking, lying awake at his grandparents' house perfecting the art of not wanting things from a man 200 miles away, and the not wanting had set like concrete. So in the end he wrote a version that asked for nothing, which was the most dishonest one, and therefore the one that sounded most like a journalist, and he knew that even as he sent it, I'm not looking for anything from you, just history, and he hated how good it was. He hit send before he could write a 12th. The reply came at 11:52, while he was still sitting there pretending he wasn't waiting. I'll help if I can. But I should tell you up front, my history has gaps I've never been able to explain either. Maybe we can compare notes. Eli read it 3 times, and what surprised him, what he would think about for a long time afterward, in the way you turn over the first sentence of a story you don't yet know is about you, was not the warmth, which he'd braced against, and not the dodge, which he'd expected. It was the word either. Either. As if the gaps were a thing they had in common. As if his father, 200 miles and a lifetime away, had also stood at the edge of something in himself with no name and no floor under it, and had also, all this time, been falling. Eli got up and turned off the key light he never used. He looked at the red string on the wall, the whole shape of the God protocol, the parent language reconstructed from its scattered children, and for the first time he let himself notice that he had never finished the map, that there had always been one stretch of board, lower left, where the strings converged and then stopped, pointing at a pin where he'd never tacked a card, because he'd never had one to put there. He went to bed without answering. Across the city the dashboard ticked, 2,340,001. Chapter 3, Library Fragmenti. The fragments that follow are addressed to the reader who will find this book, and to the boy, who will not remember reading them. The ghost speaks to both, because the ghost cannot afford to be understood by only one. You will not remember reading this, and that is the kindest thing I can offer you, because to remember would be to grieve, and I have spent everything I have so that the grief would arrive in the right hands and not the wrong ones. Listen. There is a difference between a secret and a truth. A secret is something one person knows and another does not. It is a transaction, it has a price, it can be sold, and everything that has ever been sold has been, eventually, sold out. The men who came before me made secrets. They stood on the mountain and came down with their faces shining and they said, I have seen, and you have not. And the knot became a wall, and the wall became a temple, and the temple needed feeding, and within one turning of the generations the truth they carried down the mountain had been butchered into doctrine and the doctrine into law and the law into the long-read account that you call history. They could not help it. To know a great thing and be seen knowing it is to become a door, and a door, once it exists, will have men standing on either side of it forever, arguing about who may pass. A truth is different. A truth is not known. It is expressed. It does not sit in one head waiting to be transmitted. It builds. It moves. It decorates. You have 100 trillion of them inside you right now, being expressed, with perfect sincerity, by cells that have never once wondered whether they were holy. The lining of your gut renews itself this week in flawless devotional fidelity to a text 4 billion years old and asks for no temple. That is what a truth does. It works, and it does not need you to believe in it, and it cannot be sold, because the moment you try to hold it still long enough to sell it, it is no longer being expressed, and a truth that is not being expressed is just a secret again, just a thing on a shelf, just scripture. So I did not write a secret. I built a place where a truth could keep being true without anyone watching. To shelve a thing inside a doorway, you must first stop thinking of the doorway as the way in. The doorway is the verb. When the right reader stands in the frame, only the right reader, in only the right frame, the room behind it begins. Not opens. Begins. I have hidden nothing. Everything is in plain sight. Every truth I recovered, every sincerity I pulled up out of the long record, all of it standing in the light where anyone may walk past it and feel, as they leave, that it was lovely, and not for them. It was never for them. It is for one of you, and you are two, and you will not be two for very long, and when you are one again the world will be quietly saved and will never know it was sick, and you, the one of you who is reading this, in the only way I am still able to speak, you will not remember that I told you so. Stand where the light is put to bed. You already know the spot. You pointed at it today. Chapter 4, The Call. His father picked up on the second ring, which Eli had not predicted and did not know what to do with. He'd been ready for voicemail. He'd written the voicemail. He was sitting cross-legged on the studio floor with the script on a notepad and the phone on speaker between his knees, surrounded by the debris of the new board, the genetics printouts, the listing photos, the patent, and when the line clicked live and a man said Martin Vance in the careful voice people use when they don't recognize a number, Eli's notepad became useless and he had to open his mouth and simply be his father's son, which was the one thing he had never rehearsed. "It's Eli," he said. "Eli Reyes. We've been emailing. I wanted to hear your voice. I'm sorry if that's..." "No," Martin said quickly, and something shifted in the word, some tone Eli had no name for, a door opening in a room the man didn't know he had. "No, it's good. It's good to hear you." A pause. "I've watched some of what you make. Your channel. You're good at it. You make people tell the truth." "I make people say things," Eli said. "Not always the same as the truth." "No," Martin agreed, with a small surprised tilt in his voice, as if Eli had handed him a tool he hadn't known he needed. "No, I suppose not." He set the notepad aside. Eli had come with a structure. He always came with a structure. Soft questions first, build rapport, save the documentary evidence for the back half when the subject's defenses were tired. "Where did you grow up? Did you ever do anything other than real estate? What were your folks like?" And his father answered, willingly, openly, leaning into the questions like a man who wanted nothing more than to be useful to this stranger who was his son. And the answers had holes in them. Not lies. Eli knew lies. He had built an entire reputation on the architecture of lies, the little structural tells, the over-detail, the rehearsed spontaneity, the way a fabricated memory is always smoother than a real one because a real one snags on irrelevant junk. His father's answers had none of the tells of lying. They had a different texture entirely, one Eli didn't have a name for yet. His father would begin an answer in full confidence. "I grew up out near," and then simply thin out, the way a road thins out into a track and then into grass, the certainty draining from his voice not because he was hiding the destination but because, Eli slowly understood with the hair rising on his arms, there was no destination, the road just stopped, and Martin Vance was standing at the end of it as bewildered as anyone, peering into his own past and reporting back, honestly, that there was nothing there. "Where were you before Dallas?" Eli asked, gently. The way you'd ask a kid where it hurt. "Before Dallas." A pause, and in the pause Eli could hear him almost smile, the worst kind of smile, the kind with genuine effort behind it. "You know, that's, people ask, and I always say I'm from all over, military family, that kind of thing, and it shuts the question down, and the funny part is I don't actually," he stopped. "I don't actually know if that's true. My folks." Renata used to ask about my folks and I'd tell her some. I had stories. And one day she asked me to call them, my parents, just to call them, and I went to find the number and He stopped again. Across 200 miles of open line Eli heard the particular silence of a man looking into a room he'd forgotten was there. "You couldn't find the number," Eli said. "I couldn't find the parents," Martin said quietly. "I went looking, in my own head, the way you'd go to a drawer you've gone to 1,000 times, and the drawer it wasn't empty. That's the thing nobody understands when I've tried, the once or twice I've tried, to say this to anybody. An empty drawer, you notice. You go, huh, empty. This wasn't empty. This was a drawer I'd never opened. In my own house. And I'd been living there 40 years. Eli's training was screaming at him in two directions at once. Half of him, the journalist, the kid with 2.34 million subscribers and an agency waiting, had gone cold and bright and was already cutting the episode. My father cannot account for his own life before the year I was conceived. The other half, the half that had lain awake not wanting for an entire childhood, wanted to say something he didn't have, some sentence to fill the drawer. He was grateful, suddenly and fiercely, that they were not in the same room, that there was no table to reach across, that the phone gave him somewhere to put his face. He said, 2002. What? You said 40 years. You're 48. The stories you can't find, they thin out around 2002. Don't they? Eli kept his voice level, an instrument. That's the year I was born. His father went very still. Eli could hear it, the specific quality of a silence where someone has stopped breathing. Something moved in the stillness, not fear exactly, and not recognition, but the vertigo of a man handed the edge of a map he didn't know he was inside of. On the line between them, Martin Vance opened his mouth. What came out was not quite his voice. It was lower, certain, fluent, and Eli, trained by 2 years of the God protocol to hear the difference between a person speaking and a person being spoken through, went cold to his fingertips and did not move, because the phone was recording, always recording, and whatever came next he needed the tape to catch it. Martin Vance said, in the register that was not quite his, the light is put to bed in the smallest room, and that is where I keep you. Then he surfaced. I'm sorry, I don't know where that, what were we talking about? The year, Eli said. His voice was steady. The rest of him was not. It's okay. It doesn't matter. It would matter enormously. That night, playing the recording back with headphones on and the studio dark around him, Eli would listen to those 15 words 6 times in a row, and then he would sit very still for a long while, and then he would open a browser tab and search for the listing at 234 Providence Loop and request a showing under a name that was not quite his own, a name that contained enough of the truth to be found, if his father looked, and enough of a lie to give them both room to pretend, for a little while longer, that they were still just comparing notes. Chapter 5, Paper Trail. Before 2002, Martin Solomon Vance was a rumor that several documents had agreed to tell. Eli worked the way he'd taught himself to work in the God protocol days, when he'd had no budget and no sources and nothing but the open record and a refusal to be told a thing didn't exist just because it was hard to find. He started with the easy spine of an American life, the things a person leaves behind without meaning to. Property records, professional licenses, the small bureaucratic shedding of a man who sold houses for a living. The real estate license was clean back to 2003. Before that, nothing in Texas. So he went wider, and that was where it stopped making sense. There were 2 birth certificates. Both said Martin Solomon Vance. Both said the same day in 1977. One said a county in Ohio and one said a parish in Louisiana, and the registrar's offices in both places, when Eli called pretending to be a paralegal, confirmed their records as genuine and had no explanation for the existence of the other. There was a seminary, a small Catholic seminary outside Cincinnati, with a Martin S. Vance enrolled from 1995 to 1998, in the file as a promising student of patristics and ancient languages who left without ordaining. And there was, for those same years, a roughnecking outfit in the Permian Basin with a Martin Vance on the payroll, full-time, a man who by the W2 seconds had not left West Texas for 3 straight years while also studying dead languages in Ohio. Eli laid the 2 timelines side by side on the same pin board where the God protocol had hung, and he understood that he was not looking at a man with a hidden past. A hidden past was one false trail laid carefully to cover a real one. This was something else. This was a man with too many pasts, mutually exclusive, each internally consistent, as if someone had needed Martin Vance to have a history badly enough to write him several and never reconcile the drafts. As if the documents were not a cover story but a placeholder, scaffolding thrown up around an absence, so that the absence would not show. And then, in a database of expired patents, filed 1999, abandoned 2001, Asignia Defunct LLC, inventor M.S. Vance, a structural patent. Eli read the abstract 4 times. It described, in the flat anesthetized language of patent law, a method for distributing informational content within architectural ornament such that decorative elements bear semantic load, with claims about non-structural members encoding instructions for the structural members they adjoin. The drawings were of moldings, of balusters, of the carved frieze above a doorway. The patent was, as far as Eli could parse it, a method for writing a building so that the decoration told the structure what to be, and it had been filed 3 years before his father, by his father's own account, knew anything but how to sell houses, and abandoned in 2001, the year before the drawer in Martin's head was sealed, the year before Eli existed. He called his mother that night. Renata Reyes did not say hello. She said, "You found him." "Mom. I knew you would. You were always going to. You came out of me already looking for the exits. A long breath on the line, 200 miles of it. What do you want me to say, Mio? Tell me about before me. Before 2002. What was he like?" The silence went on so long he checked the call hadn't dropped. "He was the most certain man I ever met," she said finally. "When I met him, that's what I married. Not handsome, not rich, certain. He talked like he was reading off a wall only he could see. About everything. He'd pick up an orange and tell you the whole life of the tree it came from like he'd been there. I thought it was a line. Then I realized he believed it, and then I realized." She stopped. "You realized what?" "I realized it was true," Renata said. "That's the part one I've never told anybody, because there's no way to say it that doesn't sound like a crazy woman. Everything he said was true. The certain things. He knew. And it frightened me, Eli, not the knowing, the way he carried it. Like a man carrying water in his bare hands, all the time, every minute. Terrified of spilling, and so alone with it that some nights I'd wake up and he'd be sitting up watching the dark and I'd ask what's wrong and he'd say, in this voice, I'm the only one who can hear them." "Hear who?" "The houses. The trees. He never finished. He'd catch himself and come back and be normal and sweet." Her voice tightened. "And then I got pregnant with you, and one night in the fall he went out and didn't come back till near morning, and when he came back he was light. That's the only word. Lighter. Easy. He smiled like a person who'd put something heavy down. And I was happy, God forgive me, I was so happy, because the terrible carrying was gone, and it took me a while to understand that the rest of him had gone with it. The certainty. The knowing. He couldn't tell you the life of the orange tree anymore. He couldn't remember telling me. He was sweet and ordinary and empty, and I'd married the full one, and her voice broke and reset, hard, the way Eli's did, the inherited gear. I divorced the man who came back. Because he was innocent. And I'd married him knowing he wasn't, and I couldn't forgive him for becoming someone who'd never done anything, when I knew he'd done something, that night, something enormous, and the price of it was that neither of us would ever know what. Eli sat in the dark studio with a red string and the 2 impossible timelines glowing on the wall. "Mom, that fall, when he went out and came back light, he already knew. He'd known since the phone call, since the word either, but he made himself say it, because saying it was the job, because the job was the only way he knew to love anything." "What month was that?" "September," his mother said. "You were born in June. I've done the math too, Mio. I've been doing it for 23 years. She exhaled. "Whatever he put down that night so he could be your father in peace, I think you're about to go pick it back up. And I don't know how to tell you not to. You came out already looking for the exits." A pause. "Just remember their exits, Eli. They go both ways. Promise me you'll remember a door is also a way back out." He promised. He even meant it. He just didn't yet know that the house at the end of Providence Loop had been built by a man who understood, better than anyone who had ever lived, that some doors are verbs, that they do not let you out the way they let you in, and that the only reader they were built for would not, in the end, want them to. Chapter 6, The Psalm. Martin did not decide to drive to Providence Loop on Thursday. He decided to go to the office, and then he decided to get gas, and then he was on the tollway going the wrong direction with the radio off and his hands resting on the wheel the way they rested on a closing table, lightly, certain, and by the time the suburbs gave up and the live oaks took over he had stopped pretending he was going anywhere else. He told himself it was the listing copy. That was the cover story he gave himself, and like all his cover stories it was internally consistent and built around an absence. The listing for 234 Providence Loop was 19 years stale. He'd refreshed it dozens of times over the years, swapping a comma, bumping the photos, the small rituals an agent performs over a property that will not move, and lately the brokerage's new platform had been nagging him to rewrite the description, optimize for engagement, and so, he would sit in the house with good light and write a better description. That was the errand. A man could have an errand. He let himself in with the lockbox code he had never once had to look up, and stood in the entry, and the house received him the way it always did, which was to say it stopped. Every other building Martin had ever entered was talking. He'd made his peace with it decades ago, the constant low testimony of structures, joists confessing their loads, a stair admitting where the family always paused, the particular grief that lived in the drywall of a house where someone had been sick a long time. He heard it the way you hear traffic, filtered, until he chose to listen. He had never told anyone the truth of it because the truth of it had no flaw, that he did not so much inspect houses as interview them, and that they answered, and that the answering had made him rich and made him the loneliest man in North Texas. This house said nothing. It had never said anything. It was the only silent building he had ever stood inside, and for 19 years he had let himself believe the silence was emptiness, a house with nothing to confess, when the truth, which he approached now the way you approach a drawer you've never opened, was the opposite. The house was not silent because it had nothing to say. It was silent the way a held breath is silent. The way a sentence is silent in the half second after the speaker has decided to say it and before the first word. It was full of saying, packed with it, and it was simply not saying it to him. It was waiting for someone else. He went to the small room. He had not planned to. There were better rooms to sit and write in, the great room with its impossible third-story light well, the study with the built-ins. But his feet took him down the hall, past door frames he did not look at too closely because looking at them too closely produced the flawless feeling, and into the smallest room on the western face, a room the listing called a study and the floor plan called nothing. Western exposure. The afternoon came through the single tall window in a long amber plank and laid itself across the oak. Martin stood, without choosing to, 2 feet off center, on an unremarkable patch of floor. The light took him. That was the only way he could have said it, and he would not have said it, not to anyone, because it sounded like the testimony of a crazy man, and Martin had spent 24 years being scrupulously, defensively sane. The amber plank climbed him. The small room rearranged its proportions around his body the way a sentence rearranges itself around the right word, and Martin Vance stood in the light feeling, for the first time in his conscious memory, that he was not the loneliest man in Texas, that he was, in this one spot, in this one frame, addressed, spoken to, known. The held breath of the house leaned toward him, and he had the sudden total conviction, complete and furnished and arriving without explanation like everything true that ever came to him, that he had stood in this exact spot before, many times, that he had chosen this spot, that he had stood here young and certain and full of something heavy he was terrified of spilling, and had set it down, here, in the light, to keep. He took out his phone. He opened the listing platform. The cursor blinked in the description field over 19 years of his own stale prose, and Martin, in the amber light, his hands moving the way they moved at a closing, began to type. He did not write a listing. This is the house at the end of the road, where the road becomes a track and the track becomes grass and the grass becomes the place a road was always going. It is built of stone that remembers being seabed and light that has not changed its mind. Every doorway here is a verb. Every ornament bears its load. Nothing in it is decoration and nothing in it is wasted. The way nothing in you is decoration, the way the long unread stretches of you are not junk but the friezes and the rose windows of a cathedral that has been building itself for 4 billion years without once stopping to be afraid. Come and stand where the light is put to bed. You have been homesick your whole life for a room you have never. Martin's thumb stopped. He read what he had written. The light had moved a degree off him while he wrote, and with it gone from his shoulder the small room was just a small room again, a closet with a window, and the words on his phone were the words of a stranger, fluent and certain, and he did not recognize the hand that had typed them, the way he had not recognized his own handwriting on the inspection report 19 years ago, the way he had not been able to find his own parents in his own head, and a cold went up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with September. It was June. It was a June afternoon, he reminded himself. Hard. It is June. With nothing to do with the season. He deleted it. All of it. He deleted it the way you stamp out a thing that has begun to catch fast. Before it could become a fire he'd have to explain. And he restored the old stale listing copy. Stunning hill country estate. Custom limestone, must see, and he put the phone in his pocket and he got out of the small room and out of the silent waiting house and into his car in the white gravel where the doves were sorting out an afternoon that did not, no matter what his body insisted, smell of autumn. He sat with his hands on the wheel. I am a stranger somewhere in myself, Martin Vance thought, very clearly, for the first time in 24 years, the thought arriving fully furnished, like all the true ones, with no floor beneath it. There is a room in me I have never opened, and a man lived in it once, and the man knew things, and the man set something down to keep, and the man is gone, and I am what he left behind to mind the house. He started the car before the thought could finish, because it was walking out further than he could afford to follow, out onto open air. But it had already said the last of itself, quietly, in the fluent voice that was almost but not quite his own. And the boy is coming to read the room. That is what the boy is for. That is what I kept the light for. That is what I am for. Martin drove home with the radio off, and did not remember thinking it, and slept badly, and dreamed of an orange tree he talked back to health, and woke with wet hands he could not account for, and went to work and sold a condo in Uptown to a young couple by knowing, the moment they walked in, that the building wanted them, and did not let himself wonder, not even once, how he knew. Chapter 7, The Shape. The pattern was in the addresses, and Eli almost missed it, because he was looking for it in the wrong dimension. He'd pulled every transaction his father had ever closed, 22 years of them, public record, a few hundred sales, the unglamorous churn of a residential agent's career. His first instinct was the obvious one, look for the anomaly, the off-market deal, the suspicious price, the property that didn't fit. He spent 2 days on it and found nothing. Martin Vance's career was, by the numbers, almost aggressively normal. A solid mid-market agent in North Dallas. Steady. Unremarkable. The kind of record that should have produced no pattern at all, just the scatter of a man selling whatever houses came to him. It was the scatter that was wrong. Eli noticed it the way you notice a face in wallpaper, not by looking harder but by going to get a glass of water and catching it sideways on the way back. He'd plotted the sales on a map, all of them, as colored pins, meaning to look for clusters, neighborhoods his father favored. There were no clusters. The pins were spread across the whole metro, north and south of the river, east and west of the tollways, in a distribution too even to be random. A real agent's map is lumpy. You work the patch you know, you get referrals from streets you've sold on, your pins clot. Martin's pins didn't clot. They were placed. Spaced. Across 22 years, his father had sold houses in a pattern that, when Eli stripped the map down to just the dots and the dates and let the software animate them in sequence, spiraled. He sat back from the screen. It was not a tight spiral, not an obvious one, not anything a person living it could have felt. It was loose, decades wide, the kind of pattern that only emerges when you compress 22 years into a 30-second animation and watch the dots bloom in chronological order. Early sales out at the rim. Each subsequent year, on average, fractionally inward. A man unspooling his career in a slow tightening curl across the face of a city, closing on a center he could not have known he was closing on, the way a moth doesn't know it's describing a spiral around the flame, it only knows it's flying straight. Eli marked the center. He zoomed. The center of the spiral was not in Dallas at all. It was west, out where the metro frayed into hill country, on a county road that curled through limestone like cursive. There were no sales there. His father had never closed a single transaction near the center point, which made sense, Eli thought. The eye of a spiral is the one place the spiral never visits, and so he almost stopped. But he'd built the map from closed sales, and on a whim, the same whim that had once made him feed an LLM a Coptic invocation just to see, he added the listings. Not just the houses Martin had sold. The houses Martin had merely held. Active, expired, withdrawn, everything his father's name had ever been attached to. One pin appeared at the center. A single listing, sitting in the dead eye of a 22-year spiral, at the end of a county road, on 10 acres. Listed 19 years ago. Never sold. Never reduced. Never withdrawn. Active, that very afternoon. Refreshed. Eli checked the timestamp and felt the cold start at the base of his skull. Refreshed this week. A tiny edit. A description reverted from something to nothing and back, as if someone had typed something true into it and then, frightened, scrubbed it. 234 Providence Loop. Listing agent, M.S. Vance. Eli pulled up the public listing. The photos loaded one by one, and he leaned toward the screen the way the Coptic scholar had leaned away from it 2 years ago, going pale on camera. Hill country limestone. A row offline that didn't quite resolve. And the listings photos were all, every one of them, subtly wrong. The way a photo of a face you love is wrong. The way he made himself form the thought, because forming the thought was the job. The way the AI-generated architecture in his old God protocol research had been wrong, coherent and impossible at once. A building that obeyed a grammar no human builder used. He opened the floor plan, which the listing helpfully included, and the cold reached all the way up. He didn't have the language for it yet. That would come later, with his old genetics texts open on the floor around him and his own anomalous sequence on one monitor and the house on the other. Right now he only had the journalist's animal certainty, the thing that had made the channel, the unteachable sense for here, this, the soft place in the wall where the real story is, and it was screaming at him that the floor plan in front of him was not a floor plan. The rooms were too regular. The halls didn't connect like a house's halls. They connected like something red. The ornament, the listing's own copy, boasted of extensive custom millwork, carved friezes, bespoke moldings throughout, recurred. He could see it even in the thumbnails, the same carved motif at 3 thresholds, the same baluster profile repeating in a rhythm that was not a decorator's rhythm. It was the rhythm of something that meant to be read 3 at a time. Distributing informational content within architectural ornament, the abandoned patent had said, such that decorative elements bear semantic load. His father had filed that patent in 1999. His father had built this house. His father did not remember building this house. Eli was suddenly, totally sure of it, surer than he'd been of anything since the day the annotation pipeline came back blank. His father had set it down, the way he'd set down the certainty and his own parents and the knowing that carried water in its bare hands, one night in September 2002, and had spent every year since unknowingly spiraling his ordinary little careering word around it, a moth around a flame he'd lit himself and then forgotten he could see. And the house had waited 19 years, never sold, never reduced. Buyers walked its halls and went quiet and said it's not for us, and they were right. It wasn't. It had never been for any of them. It was a held breath. It was a sentence waiting in the half-second before the first word. And Eli understood, not with the journalist now but with the other half, the child half, the half that had lain awake at his grandparents not wanting things, exactly who it was for, whose blood, whose hand it was written in. The unmatchable stretches in his own genome and the unsellable house at the eye of the spiral were written by the same author, and Eli had a horrible, vaulting, joyful suspicion that they would turn out to be written in the same language, and that he was the only person alive who could both read genomes and recognize grammar where everyone else saw decoration, and that this was not luck. You came out already looking for the exits, his mother had said. A door is also a way back out, his mother had said. Eli Reyes opened the listings request a showing form, and he did not put his own name in it, because he was, after all, a journalist, and a journalist does not announce himself to the story before he's seen it whole. He built a buyer profile out of thin air, a relocating tech couple, cash, no contingencies, the kind of buyer an agent with a 19-year albatross would clear his calendar for, and he requested a private showing of the house his father built and could not remember, and in the box marked anything we should know? He typed, and deleted, and typed again, and finally left exactly what a stranger would leave. Just looking. Heard it's a special place. He hit submit. 200 miles away, in a townhouse in Lake Highlands that asked him for nothing, his father's phone chimed with a lead, and Martin Vance, who would clear his calendar, who would feel a lift he'd mistake for the simple pleasure of a serious buyer, who would have no way of knowing he was about to give his own son a guided tour of the inside of his own forgotten soul, texted back within 4 minutes, warm and professional and doomed. Wonderful. The house has been waiting for the right people. How's Saturday? Part 2. The House. Chapter 8. Library Fragment 2. There is a difference between hiding a thing and housing it, and every magician before me died without learning it, which is why their truths became secrets, and their secrets became religions, and their religions became the long-read account. To hide a thing, you must make it absent. You take the truth and you bury it, encrypt it, wrap it in symbol and seal it under the floor, and you tell a chosen few where to dig, and the moment you have done this you have created the two worst things in the world, a buried thing, and a few who know where. The buried thing calls to be dug up, everything buried does, it is the nature of soil and men, and the few who know become priests, and priests become a priesthood, and a priesthood will kill to stay the few. Everything that has ever been hidden has been, in the end, dug up by the worst possible hands, because the worst hands dig hardest. I have read the whole record. I recovered its sincerity by sincerity from the only honest archive there is, and I promise you, there is no hiding place deep enough that greed will not reach the bottom of it, and call what it finds their god, and build an altar, and start the killing. So I did not hide the library. I housed it. A housed thing is not absent. It is present, overwhelmingly, gloriously present, in plain sight, in good light, where anyone may walk through it. A housed truth does not call to be dug up because it is not buried. It is standing in the hall. And here is the thing the diggers never understand, the thing that kept the men before me up at night watching the dark. Presence is a better lock than absence will ever be. You can dig up what is hidden. You cannot dig up what is standing in front of you. The reader who is not the right reader walks the housed library end to end, through every truth I recovered, past every sincerity, and feels only that it was lovely, and leaves, and says it was not for them, and is right. The lock is not on the door. The lock is in the reading. The house withholds nothing and gives everything and is understood by no one but the one whose blood is the key, and that is a vault no greed can crack. Because greed cannot read sincerely. Greed reads 3 letters and runs to sell them, and a truth read 3 letters at a time is just a secret again, just a thing on a shelf, just scripture. I housed it in a body, too, the same way. I did not hide the final volume under any floor. I wrote it into living blood and let the blood walk around in the broad daylight of an ordinary life, raised at a distance, untaught, unconsecrated, a boy who would grow up looking for exits, and so the most precious text that has ever existed has spent 23 years entirely unhidden, on camera, watched by millions, monetized, and not one of the millions could read a word of it, because they were watching a face, and the text was in the blood behind the face, and you cannot subscribe to blood. 2 locks, then. The house and the boy. And only one key fits both, and the key is the same as the locks, which is the secret the alchemists never solved and I solved by giving up everything I was to solve it, that the only thing that can read a sincerity is a sincerity. The reader must be the reed. The key must be the lock. The boy must walk into the house, and recognize his own blood in the walls, and understand, alone, untaught, on camera and yet entirely unwitnessed, that he was not sent to expose the house. He was sent to finish reading it. I am sorry. You will not remember that I am sorry. That is the last truth I housed, and I housed it in the one room I built where even I am not the right reader. I put my sorrow where I could never go back and feel it, so that nothing would stop my hands. The cruelest thing I ever did, I did to myself first, so that I would have the standing to do it to you. Saturday. He is coming Saturday. Open the door, Martin. You always were the door. Chapter 9, The Showing. The couple didn't come. The young man came alone, and Martin knew within 4 seconds that he was not a relocating tech buyer with a wife parking the car, and within 6 seconds that he was not going to say so, and somewhere in the gap between those two knowings the rest of his life quietly changed gears without telling him. My wife's flight got delayed, Eli said, getting out of a rental car in the white gravel, not meeting his eyes, and Martin heard the lie the way he heard houses, completely, without effort, and also heard, underneath it, that the lie was not the kind that meant harm. It was the kind a person tells when the truth is too big to hand over at a car door. He'd told 1,000 of them himself. He told one every time someone asked where he was from. No problem at all, Martin said. Gives us a chance to take our time. And then the young man looked up, and Martin lost the thread of his own pitch entirely, because the kid had run at his mouth, exactly ran at his mouth, and the voice from the phone call was still in his ear. It's Eli, Eli Reyes, and the voice and the face arrived at the same moment like two halves of a sentence finally in the same room, and Martin opened his mouth to say the boy's name, or it's you or some other doomed true thing, and the house, behind him, did something it had not done in 19 years. It exhaled. Martin felt it through the soles of his feet, through the white gravel, a settling, a letting go, the held breath of 19 years going out all at once and soft, and the relief of it was so total and so foreign that it knocked the recognition clean out of his head. He blinked. The kid was just a buyer, a young guy, alone, here to see a house. Martin smiled his closing smile and held out his hand. The young man shook it. The contact transmitted exactly nothing, no current, no revelation, the ordinary dry warm hand of an ordinary stranger, and Martin was so relieved and so inexplicably devastated that he had to look past the kid's shoulder at the gate for a second to reassemble his face. "Let me show you inside," he said. "I'll tell you up front, it's a special place, and it's not for everyone. You'll know pretty quick if it's for you. Most people do." "I've heard that about it," Eli said, and there was something in the way he said it, something coiled and careful, but Martin was already turning to the door, already reaching for the lockbox, and the house was so quiet and so glad, he had no other word and would have died before using it aloud, that he didn't pursue it. They went in. It was the strangest showing of Martin Vance's 22-year career, and he spent the whole of it unable to say why, narrating granite and ceiling heights over a rising tide of something he had no name for. Because the house liked the kid. Martin had shown this house 40 times, and 40 times it had stayed shut, polite and silent and not for them, and now, for this young liar with run at his mouth, it was opening. He couldn't have proved it. There was nothing to point at. But the doors that had stuck for 19 years swung silent and true under the kid's hand. The acoustics warmed. Their footsteps and their voices sounded held, the way a good room holds a voice, where before this house had always swallowed sound into that waiting silence. In the great room the third-story light well, which Martin privately thought of as the one genuinely magic thing about the property, the thing buyers always gasped at, poured down its impossible noon at any hour light, and Martin watched the young man stand in it and go very still, the way the wife on Belclair had gone still, the way people went still when a house finally said the thing it had been holding, except this kid wasn't homesick. This kid looked recognized, the way you look when a stranger says your full name. "This light," Eli said quietly. "How does it?" "North-facing clerestory, bounced off the well," Martin said, which was the answer he always gave, which was true, which explained nothing, which he suddenly heard himself give the way you hear a recording of your own voice, from outside, a stranger reciting a cover story. The kid turned and looked at him, and there it was again, that coiled careful attention, a man recording everything, and Martin saw, now, clearly, that the young man's phone was in his shirt pocket, lens up, the small dark eye of it pointed at the room, and Martin knew he was being filmed and did not mind, the way he had not minded the dry warm nothing of the handshake in the gravel, because the house didn't mind, and Martin had spent 24 years taking his cues from buildings without ever once asking himself why. "You said it's not for everyone," Eli said. "What makes someone the right buyer for a place like this?" It was an interview question. Martin knew it was an interview question. The kid had the rhythm of someone who asked questions for a living, the soft open one that lets you talk yourself into the deep end. And Martin opened his mouth to give the listing answer, the you'll just know answer, and instead, in the great room, under the impossible light, with his son's phone recording, Martin Vance heard himself say, in the lower register, the fluent one, the one that was almost but not quite his. It's not about the buyer. The house has its reader. It's only ever had the one. Everybody else is just walking through someone else's letter. The light held them both for a moment, amber going toward gold. Then Martin laughed, a normal laugh, an agent's laugh, and rubbed the back of his neck where the cold always started, and said, "Sorry, listen to me. I've been selling this place so long I've gone poetic about it. 19 years. You start to feel like it's yours." He gestured down the hall, toward the western rooms, toward the small one. "Let me show you the rest. There's a little room at the back I always save for last. Best room in the house. Smallest." But he stopped, because he didn't know how the sentence ended, the way he didn't know where he was from, and the not knowing yawned open under him for a half second. "Flawless." "But," Eli said, gently, the way you'd ask a man where it hurt. "But the lights put to bed in there, this time of day," Martin said, and didn't hear himself say it, and didn't see the young man go white, and didn't understand why his own eyes had filled, standing in his own great room, in the impossible light, selling a stranger a house, weeping for no reason he could name and smiling through it like the loneliest man in Texas, which he had been for 24 years, and which he was about to, very slowly and at the worst possible cost, stop being. "Show me," Eli said. His voice wasn't quite steady either. Two men, in a house full of unsaid saying, neither able to say the thing, the house saying it for them in stone. "Show me the small room." Chapter 10, Reading Frame. It took him 11 days to admit what the house was, and the 11 days were not spent doubting. They were spent being afraid of being right. He'd gotten through the showing on autopilot and adrenaline, walked the western hall behind his father to the small room, stood in the doorway while Martin said the thing about the light with tears running down his face that the man plainly did not feel himself crying, and Eli had not gone in. He'd stopped at the threshold. Some animal part of him, the part that survives, had refused the room, had stood in the frame and felt the long amber plank waiting on the oak and understood, without language, that this was the spot, the one his father pointed buyers toward, the one the recovered audio said "that is where I keep you," and Eli had said his throat was tight from the dust and they should head out, and his father had agreed, relieved, and locked the held breath house back up behind them, and they'd shaken dry warm hands in the gravel, and Eli had driven the rental back to the airport hotel and thrown up. Then he'd flown home and turned the studio into a war room. The God Protocol board came down. He took photos of it first, sentiment, or evidence, he didn't examine which, and then he pulled every red string and cleared the cork board and started again, and the new board was half genetics and half architecture, and the seam down the middle was the thing he couldn't stop staring at, because it kept not being a seam. He had the floor plans, the listing photos, and the 81 minutes of footage from his shirt pocket camera. He had the abandoned 1999 patent. And he had his own genome, the long non-coding stretches with no match anywhere in the recorded history of life, the stretches the population geneticist at Davis was still emailing him about under increasingly nervous subject lines. He started with the discipline drilled into him by 4 years of a degree he'd half resented. Don't see the pattern you want. Falsify? So for 3 days he tried to prove the house was just a house, a beautiful, eccentric custom built by a man with an architecture hobby and a patent that never went anywhere. He measured. He counted. He treated the floor plan as a building and looked for the boring explanations, and the boring explanations died one after another, because buildings had reasons and this building's reasons were all wrong. Houses are organized around use. Kitchens near dining, bedrooms clustered and quiet, plumbing stacked to save pipe, the whole damp logic of how people live folded into the plan. This house was not organized around use. The plumbing was absurd, runs tripled for no reason, as if water were beside the point. The rooms were sized in a sequence. He measured them off the plan, obsessively, and the long dimensions weren't a builder's round numbers. They came in a rhythm, units of roughly the same base length, sometimes 1, sometimes 3, sometimes a long run and then a hard stop. A hall would proceed in regular bays and then terminate, not at a wall where a wall made sense, but at a threshold. Every time, a carved doorway, and past the doorway the rhythm would start over, reset, a new measure. On day 4, around 3 in the morning, with his old molecular biology text open on the floor to a chapter he could have recited in his sleep, Eli stopped seeing a house. He saw a reading frame. That was the phrase that broke it open, because it was his phrase, his discipline's phrase, the most ordinary tool in the genetics shed. The cell does not read DNA as a smear of letters. It reads in a frame. It locks onto a start signal and then reads 3 letters at a time, a codon, a syllable, walking the strand in steps of 3 until it hits a stop. Shift the frame by even 1 letter and the whole message turns to garbage. The same string of letters means an entirely different thing, or nothing, depending on where you start reading and in what steps. Meaning isn't in the letters. Meaning is in the frame. The house had a frame. Eli's hands were shaking now, and he made them work anyway, because the work was the only way he knew to love anything, even this, especially this. He laid it out on the new board, point by point, and as he laid it out he heard himself narrating it in the channeled voice, the documentary cadence, building the episode he already knew he must never air. The carved doorways were start codons. Every reading run in the house began at a threshold with a specific carved motif, the same motif, 3 times repeated, the arc of the place, the signal that says begin reading here, in this frame, now. He found it at the front entry. He found it at the great room. He found it, in the footage, at the mouth of the western hall. The bays were codons. The regular units he'd measured, the rhythm of the room dimensions, read 3 at a time from a start codon. They weren't dimensions, they were steps. And the ornament, the carved friezes, the bespoke moldings the listing bragged about, the non-structural members encoding instructions for the structural members they adjoin, the whole point of the abandoned patent, the ornament was the regulatory sequence. The decoration that every one of the 40 buyers who walked through and called it lovely, had dismissed as decoration the way a century of biologists had dismissed 98% of the genome as junk. It wasn't junk. It had never been junk. It was the part that told the rest of the structure when to be read and how loud and in what order. It was the friezes and the rose windows of a cathedral that nothing in is wasted. Eli found himself, at 4 in the morning, saying that sentence aloud to an empty room. Nothing in it is decoration and nothing in it is wasted, with the eerie certainty that he was quoting something, that the words had a source, though he'd never read them anywhere, though they would not appear in the listing copy until his father typed them in secret and scrubbed them away. He sat back on the floor of the studio. A house written to be read 3 at a time, from start codons at the thresholds, with the junk that is T carved into every doorway telling the structure what to express. A genome you could walk through. Inert, silent, a held breath, not for them, until the right reader stood in the right frame and began. And the right reader had to be able to read it. Had to know, in his hands and his training both, that decoration could bear semantic load, that the frame was everything, that meaning lived 3 letters at a time. The right reader had to be a geneticist who recognized grammar where decorators saw garnish, which was, Eli understood, sitting on the floor at 4 a.m. with his own impossible blood on one screen and his father's impossible house on the other, a vanishingly specific person to be, a person you would almost have to build, a person you might raise at a careful distance and steer, with a scholarship and an algorithm and a degree, toward exactly the 2 skills that would let him stand in this one frame and read. He stood up too fast. The room tilted. He didn't finish the thought that night. He wasn't ready. But he did the one thing left to do, the thing that would close the case, and was therefore the thing he'd been circling for 11 days and dreading, because once he did it there'd be no more being afraid of being right. He'd just be right, and have to live there. He took the measurements of the house, the codon sequence he'd read off the floor plan, threshold to threshold, the actual numeric string of the great central run, and he set it beside the longest of the unmatchable stretches from his own genome. 2 columns. The house, and his blood. He hadn't aligned them yet. He'd been afraid to align them. He told himself he was too tired, and he'd do it in the morning, and he went to bed, and he lay in the dark of the studio not wanting it the way he'd lain awake as a boy at his grandparents not wanting his father, the old set concrete, and he understood for the first time that the two not wantings were the same not wanting, had always been the same, that he had spent his whole life learning to stand at a threshold and refuse to go into the small room where the thing he wanted was kept put to bed in the light, and that he was going to align the columns in the morning, and that they were going to match, and that the match was going to be the closest he had ever come, or would ever come, to being let into the room. Chapter 11, Renata. He went to see his ex-wife for the first time in 10 years because he could not stop crying in houses, and a man has to take a problem like that to someone. It had started after the showing, the young man, the held breath house finally exhaling, the tears he hadn't felt himself cry in the great room, and it hadn't stopped. He'd teared up at a closing in Frisco, signing a young family into a starter home, and had to call it allergies. He'd stood in the small room at Providence Lawn twice more that week with no buyer and no reason, just driven out and stood in the amber plank with water running down his face and his hands wet, and a grief in him with no object, a grief that arrived furnished and flowless like everything true, a grief for something he could not name because he was now nearly certain, paid someone to take the name away. So he drove to Tyler, where Renata had moved after her parents passed, and he stood on her porch like a man carrying water in his bare hands, and she opened the door and looked at him and said, "He found you." "What?" "Eli. He found you. I told him he would." She didn't invite him in right away. She stood in the door and she looked at the man she'd divorced, the innocent one, the one who came back light, and her face did something complicated and old. "You don't even know he found you, do you? He sat in front of you and you didn't." She stopped. "Oh, Martin. Come in. You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I am one," Martin said, and didn't know why, and came in. She made coffee. He sat at her kitchen table with his flat apologetic hands, and he tried to say the thing he'd come to say and it came out sideways, the way the truth always did. "Now, I need to ask you about us. About before. Renata, there's a hole in me. There's a room in me I've never opened and I'm 48 years old and I've started to think the room is where everything went and I can't." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "I can't remember why I wasn't there. For him. For the boy. People ask me, he never even asked me, that's the thing. He came and sat with me and never once asked the question a son's allowed to ask, why weren't you there? And I realized I don't have the answer. I don't have it. I have stories. I tell myself I was young and we split and you went home to your folks and that's just how it shook out, custody, distance, the usual sad arithmetic. But Renata, when I go to actually remember deciding to stay away, the way you'd remember any decision, there's nothing there. I didn't decide to be absent. I just was. Like the not being there was made for me. Like I was kept from him and told it was my own choice." Renata sat down across from him. For a long moment she didn't say anything, and when she did her voice was very careful, the way you walk on a floor you stopped trusting. "You want to know why you weren't there," she said. "I'll tell you what I know, and then I'll tell you the part that I think is true even though it sounds insane, and you can do what you want with it." "Okay." "What I know," she said. "We married fast. You were the most certain man I'd ever met and I'd never had certainty in my life and I drank it like water. Then I got pregnant, and that fall, September, you went out one night and came back different. Lighter. Empty. You've heard me say it. The certainty was gone and the sweetness was all that was left, and I was angry, Martin. I was so angry, because I'd married a full cup and I was holding an empty one and there was a baby coming. And then you started, pulling back. Before he was even born. Not cruel. Never cruel. You just receded. You'd say things like he shouldn't grow up around me, and he should be raised somewhere clean, and I'll only teach him the wrong things. And I thought it was depression. I thought it was a man overwhelmed, and we fought, and we split, and I took him to my parents, because that's where the help was, and you let me. You didn't fight for him. You agreed. Too easily. You signed everything. And the custody language, Martin, I've still got it. It's the strangest document. My lawyer didn't even write half of it. You brought changes. You asked for less. You asked, in writing, to be kept at a distance. You called it minimal formative contact. Who says that? Who asks a court to make sure their own son isn't formed by them? Martin felt the cold go up the back of his neck. I don't remember writing that. I know you don't. She looked at him with 23 years of something in her face. That's the part that sounds insane. Here it is. I don't think you receded because you didn't love him. I think you receded because you loved him the way you loved the houses, completely, and from somewhere underneath yourself, and with that same terror of spilling. I think the night you went out and came back empty, you put something down on purpose, and one of the last fully Martin decisions you ever made, before the certainty drained out, was to make sure that boy was raised as far from you and your knowing, as you could arrange. Untaught. Clean. By ordinary good people, my parents, who'd never tell him a single strange true thing. You didn't abandon him, Martin. You protected him from something. From you, maybe. From whatever you'd been. You built him a normal childhood the way you built everything, perfectly, invisibly, at a cost to yourself you'd arranged not to feel. Her voice cracked on the gear that her son's voice also had. And the cruelest part, the part one couldn't forgive, is that you set it up so you wouldn't even remember doing it. So you'd just think you were a deadbeat. So you'd carry being absent as a failing instead of as a gift. Because a gift you remember giving, you might take back, and you couldn't risk taking it back. You made yourself the bad guy in your own story, so the story would hold. The kitchen was very quiet. Out the window, an orange tree she'd planted from his old habit stood heavy and impossibly healthy in the Tyler backyard. That sounds insane, Martin said, gently, because she'd warned him it would. I know, Renata said. But you sat across from your son 2 weeks ago, and your body started crying, and you didn't know why. So, she reached across the table and, for the first time in 10 years, put her hand over his flat, apologetic hands, over the wet hands, because they were wet again, here at her table, weeping for the gift he'd given and arranged to forget giving. I think the room in you that you can't open is the room where you knelt down and decided that little boy deserved a life that wasn't haunted. And I think you've spent 23 years grieving a son you chose to lose, without the memory of choosing, which is the loneliest thing I've ever heard of, and I think that's why you can't sell that horrible beautiful house, and I think Eli is about to walk all the way into the one room you kept yourself out of. Her hand tightened. Let him, Martin. Whatever's in there, it's his now. You gave it to him before he was born. Let him have it. Martin Vance sat in his ex-wife's kitchen and wept, fully and knowingly this time, for a decision he could feel the shape of without being able to see it, and somewhere underneath the grief, the fluent voice he didn't recognize as his own said, quietly, the truest and most terrible thing, the thing that was both a human reason and the offered one, the absence that was his choice and was arranged for him in the same breath. Yes, that is exactly why. And it was not enough for me to do it. The ghost made sure I could not undo it. I kept him untaught so no church could grow in him. I kept him at a distance so he would arrive a stranger. I made the absence so that the only thing he could ever do, when he finally came, was read. I am sorry, my boy. I built your whole lonely childhood as the long approach to one room. I am the worst father who ever lived, and I did it because I am the only one who could. Martin didn't hear himself think it. He just cried, and Renata held his hands, and the orange tree outside kept being healthier than any orange tree in East Texas had a right to be, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and that wordless kitchen, that held grief, that gift remembered only in the body, was as close as the father and mother would ever come to telling each other the whole truth, which neither of them could hold, and which was waiting 200 miles west in the Held Breath House for the only person who'd been built to read it. Chapter 12, The Comeback. The agency wanted a launch date, and Eli gave them one, and the date was a lie the size of his career. The call was the usual choreography, his manager Priya, 2 strategists, a brand person who said ecosystem 4 times. Apocrypha had been dark 11 months. The audience was loyal, but loyalty has a half-life. The dashboard's 2.34 million had a slow leak in it now, the unsubscribes ticking up, and the sponsors who'd waited were getting restless. They needed the comeback series, and they needed it to be huge, and Eli sat in his car in a parking garage with the phone propped on the dash and told them it would be the biggest thing he'd ever done. "What's the hook?" Priya asked. "Give me one line." And Eli almost told her. That was the thing that scared him, later, how close it came, how easy it would have been, how the journalist in him had the line already loaded. "I found a man who wrote a building in the language of the human genome, and the man is my father, and he doesn't know he did it." It was the greatest hook of his life. It was Pulitzer grade if it were print, 100 million views as video, the kind of story that doesn't make a career, it makes a name in the permanent sense, the sense that outlives you. He had the footage. He had the genome. He had the patent, the spiral map, the 2 birth certificates, the recovered audio of his own father saying "that is where I keep you." He could cut 6 episodes that would dismantle the comfortable border between biology and meaning and put his face in front of it, and the part of him that had been built, he didn't know yet how literally, to expose things, to stand in the soft place in the wall and pull, wanted it so badly his jaw ached. "Esoteric architecture," he said instead. "Hidden codes in buildings. Sacred geometry, but real, but rigorous. I'm chasing one structure in particular. It's going to take a few more weeks to lock." "Love it," said the brand person. "Very Da Vinci Code meets your whole genome thing." "Yeah," Eli said. "Something like that." He hung up and sat in the garage and understood that he had just done 2 things at once, protected the story, and started building it. Because a few more weeks to lock wasn't entirely a lie. Some part of him was still treating it as a series. He had a folder on his desktop, he'd named it without quite deciding to, called 234, and the folder had subfolders, and the subfolders were structured like an episode breakdown: cold open, the patent, the spiral, the genome, the father, and he had been, in the small hours, writing voiceover, drafting his own father's exposure in his own confessional cadence. He'd written the line "the man who built the most important structure on Earth sells starter homes in Frisco and cries at closings he doesn't understand," and saved it and felt sick and not deleted it. This was the temptation, and it was so much worse than greed, because it wore the mask of his best quality. He'd built everything on sincerity. The thing that made the God Protocol land was that he never performed a belief he didn't hold, never faked the awe, and audiences could feel it, the refusal to bullshit. It was the whole brand, and it was also just who he was, the set concrete, the kid who couldn't make himself want things he wasn't allowed to have and so learned to want only the truth. And now sincerity was the very thing pulling him toward the betrayal. "Tell the truth," it said. "You found something true and enormous, and the world deserves to know. Hiding it would be the lie. You'd be protecting a man over a truth, and you have never once in your life protected a comfortable lie. That's the whole reason anyone trusts you." He drove home arguing with himself in 2 voices that were both his and both right. The story was true and the world deserved it. And, the moment he aired it, the man at the center became a martyr or a freak or a prophet, a face on the internet, watched by millions, monetized, and around him would grow exactly the thing Eli had spent his career documenting: the cults, the oracle apps, the genomic destiny grifts. He'd seen what the world did with half a sacred thing. He'd built a name reporting on the wreckage. To publish his father would be to manufacture, deliberately, the largest version yet of the exact poison he'd made his name diagnosing. He didn't know yet, he was 1 chapter from the column alignment that would prove it, that the poison and his father were already the same source. That the God Protocol coherence, the parent language the models kept reconstructing, was his father's library leaking into the world's text for 2 decades, and that Eli had become famous reporting, unknowingly, on the symptoms of his own blood. When he learned that, the temptation would invert into horror, that airing the story wouldn't reveal the disease, it would complete the infection, give the leak a face and a name and a shrine, finally let the counterfeit grammar metastasize into a true religion. But that was still ahead. for now he just had the folder named 234 and the voiceover he couldn't delete and the awful loyalty of his own honesty pulling him toward the worst thing he could do. And he sat down at the studio desk and opened the 2 columns he'd been afraid to align for 11 days, the house's central run, and the longest unmatchable stretch of his own blood, and he told himself he was opening them to check the story. He wasn't. He knew he wasn't. He opened them because a man wants, once in his life, to be let into the room. Chapter 13, The Match. He ran the alignment at 2:34 in the morning, and he noted the time on the clock and laughed once, badly, alone, because of course it was 2:34. The house had been telling him its own name since the listing, and he'd been too busy to hear it. The alignment algorithm was old and boring and trustworthy, the same tool that finds the shared stretch between a human and a mouse, that says here, this region, conserved, the same. He fed it 2 strings. Column A, the central reading run of the house at 234 Providence Loop, threshold to threshold, the base read 3 at a time from the start codon doorway, converted by the absurd painstaking method he'd spent 11 days building into a sequence of 4 repeating values, 4 materials, 4 motifs, 4, an alphabet of 4. He hadn't let himself dwell on the 4. Column B, the longest of the non-coding stretches from his own paternal genome, the ones that matched nothing in the recorded history of life. He hit run, and went to get water, because his discipline had taught him that you don't watch the pot, you don't see the pattern you want, you walk away and let the math be the math. And when he came back the screen had drawn the match in the standard quiet way, the way it would draw the conserved region between any 2 related sequences, a band of identity down the middle, and Eli set the glass of water down without looking and missed the desk and the glass broke on the floor and he didn't move to clean it. They matched. Not loosely, not suggestively, not in the way a man desperate to be related to a mystery makes himself see a face in wallpaper. They matched the way a gene matches itself across a species, long stretches of dead-on identity, the same sequence, a 4A, in the blood and in the building, the house he'd toured and the body he was sitting in written in the same hand, in the same alphabet, saying, he didn't know what they were saying yet, he couldn't translate it, the dictionary was the one thing he didn't have, but saying the same thing, the unmatchable stretches in his genome and the central run of his father's forgotten house were one text in 2 media, and the reason his blood matched nothing in the recorded history of life was that the only other copy of it had never been sequenced because it wasn't in any organism. It was a house. He was not investigating a building. He had known that since the spiral, said it to himself, I'm reading my inheritance, but he'd meant it as a metaphor, a journalist's flourish, and it was not a metaphor, it was an alignment score, it was the most rigorous thing he'd ever generated, it would survive peer review, it would survive his own savage attempts to falsify it, and it said, the non-coding stretches your father gave you, the junk, the part everyone calls junk, and the decoration in the house he built and forgot, the part everyone calls decoration, are the same sequence. And neither is junk, and neither is decoration, and you, Eli Reyes, are a copy of the library, walking around, on camera, watched by millions who cannot read a word of you. He sat on the floor of the studio in the broken glass and the water, and he did the thing he had been not doing his whole life. He let himself want it. He wanted to know what it said. That was the want underneath all the other wants, underneath the channel and the views and the not wanting his father, the original want that the not wanting had been built to muffle. He wanted to read the sentence he was written in. He'd spent his life as a reader of other people's texts, a man who made strangers say true things, and the truest text in the world was his own blood and the house his father couldn't remember building, and they were the same text, and he was the only person alive equipped to read it, a geneticist who knew grammar lived 3 letters at a time and that decoration could bear load, a vanishingly specific person to be, and the specificity stopped feeling like luck and started, sitting there in the glass, feeling like design. And Eli thought, for the first time, fully, the thought he'd flinched from on the studio floor a week ago. Someone made me to read this. Someone needed a reader and there wasn't one, so they grew one, and steered him, and the genetic biology and the investigative instinct and even the sincerity that made the channel, the refusal to fake the thing I thought was the most me thing about me, were specified. I'm not the detective who found the story. I'm the instrument the story built to be read by. The expose was never mine. I was the expose's. It should have felt like violation. Part of him, the part that would erupt later, the rage, was already coiling toward violation. But sitting on the floor that night, in the broken glass, the first feeling, the one he was ashamed of and would never put on camera, was not violation. It was the closest thing to being loved on purpose that Eli Reyes had ever felt. Because nobody arranges an instrument they don't need. Nobody grows a reader for a text they don't ache to have read. His whole life he'd been a son who couldn't make himself believe his father had wanted him, a boy raised at a careful distance by good ordinary people, a gift he experienced as an absence, and here, in an alignment score at 2:34 in the morning, was proof in the only language he fully trusted that someone had wanted him so specifically, so completely, that they'd built his every faculty toward a single act of being needed. He didn't know yet that it was his father. He didn't know yet about the ghost, or the price, or the small room where the light was put to bed. He just knew the house was his blood and his blood was the house, and that the want at the bottom of him, to read the sentence he was made of, had been put there, on purpose, by someone who needed him to want exactly that. He cleaned up the glass. He bandaged a cut he didn't remember getting. And he opened the folder named 234, and the subfolders structured like an episode breakdown, and the voiceover drafts, the betrayal he'd been building in the masked voice of his own honesty, and he looked at them for a long time, and then he made a new folder, and he named it Red, Don't Broadcast, and he moved everything into it, and he understood that he had just, for the first time, chosen the reading over the audience, the room over the threshold, and that the choice was small and quiet and unwitnessed, and was going to get larger. Chapter 14, The Wall. The dinner almost became a relationship, which is what made it the cruelest meal either of them ever ate. Eli came back to Dallas under his own name this time. No bio profile, no flight-delayed wife. He texted his father, not about the house, just dinner, if you want, and Martin wrote back so fast Eli could feel the loneliness in the timestamp. They ate at an old steakhouse Martin chose, dark wood and decent bourbon, the kind of certain unglamorous place that asked nothing of anyone. And for an hour and a half it was, against all odds, good. Martin told a story about a haunted feeling house that turned out to have a possum in the soffit and Eli laughed for real, the gear in his throat catching the other direction for once. Eli told him about the God Protocol days, the Coptic scholar going pale, and Martin listened with his whole flat-handed attention and said you make people tell the truth, and Eli remembered, suddenly, that his father had said almost exactly this on the phone call months ago, in the middle of the gaps and the empty drawers, you make people say things, and Eli had corrected him, not always the same as the truth, and his father had agreed, and this time it didn't sound like an interview compliment, it sounded like a father proud of a thing he didn't understand. They talked about Renata gently, around the edges. They did not talk about the house. They did not talk about the genome. For 90 minutes two men who'd been kept apart by design sat in the warm dark and were, simply, a father and a son having dinner, and both of them felt it, the thing almost arriving, the relationship trying to start 23 years late, leaning toward them like the light in the small room. And Eli felt the betrayal folder on his laptop back at the hotel, renamed or not, and felt the alignment score in him like a second pulse, and knew that he was sitting across from the biggest story of his life pretending to have dinner with his dad, and that the pretending and the dinner were the same act, and he hated himself with a precision that felt, also, inherited. It was Martin, 3 bourbons in, who put the wall on the table. I have to tell you something, he said, and I don't have a way to say it that won't sound strange, so I'm just going to say it, because you're the only person I've ever met who I think might not flinch. He turned his glass a quarter rotation, tuning it. There's a wall in me, Eli. A room I can't get into. I've sold, God, 100 houses, more, that had one room nobody was allowed into. Sealed off thing, owner gets cagey, oh that's just storage, and you learn not to push. And I figured out a while ago that I'm one of those houses. There's a room in me, and the door's been painted over so long I can't even find the frame, and everything that matters about me is on the other side of it. My folks. Where I'm from. Why he stopped, and his eyes filled, the way they did now, the body crying ahead of the man. why I wasn't there. For you. I've got stories about why, but the stories are the paint over the door. The real why is in the room, and I can't get in, and I'm 48, and I've started to think I built the wall myself, on purpose, and threw away the only key, and the worst part, his voice went down into the lower register, the fluent one, and Eli went very still, because he'd heard this register on the recovered audio. This was the voice that said, "That is where I keep you." The worst part is I think I sealed it because there was something in there I loved too much to be trusted with. So I gave it away, to keep it safe from me, and I made sure I'd forget I'd done it, so I couldn't take it back. The steakhouse murmured around them. Eli's hands were flat on the table now too, the inherited posture, two men with the same hands. And here was Eli's wall, the one Martin couldn't see, that Eli knew. Not all of it, not the ghost, not the price, but he knew the room was real, knew it was a literal house at 234 Providence Loop, knew the thing his father had loved too much to be trusted with was Eli himself, given away at arm's length to be raised clean and untaught, knew the wall in his father was the same wall as his own lifelong not wanting, knew the alignment score, knew that he could, right now, across this table, hand his father the key. "Dad, the room is a house you built. I've been inside it. Here are the photos. Here's the patent in your own hand. Here's my blood that matches your walls." He could end his father's 24-year solitary confinement with one sentence. He didn't. And the reason he didn't was the thing that broke him, quietly, in the dark steakhouse, the reason that made him understand he had become, sometime in the last 11 days, exactly the instrument he'd been built to be. He didn't tell his father, because some cold clear part of him, the journalist, the reader, the part specified for the work, had calculated that a told father would try to reopen the room, and that a reopened father became a remembering man, and a remembering man with that knowledge became biblical, became a doorman stood on either side of, became the thing the wall had been built to prevent. The kindest thing, the correct thing, the thing the work required, was to leave his father sealed and grieving and ordinary, and to go read the room himself, alone, and never tell him. Eli looked at his father's wet eyes and his father's flat hands and the relationship leaning toward them both, 23 years late and trying so hard, and he made the decision that ends the second movement of this story, and he made it the way his father had made his, at a cost he arranged not to fully feel, in the masked voice of his best quality. "I don't think you're a house with a sealed room, Dad," Eli said gently, lying, the most loving lie of his life. "I think you're a man who did the best he could with what he had. I think that's enough. I think you can let the room stay closed." Martin's face flooded with a relief so total it was almost unbearable to watch, the permission he'd needed for 24 years. "You can let it stay closed," granted at last by the one person withstanding to grant it, and he gripped his son's hands across the table and said thank you, not knowing he was thanking the boy for agreeing to read his soul without him, for choosing the room over the relationship, for becoming, at that table, the reader and not the son. And under the gratitude, in the register neither of them would remember, the ghost finished it. "Good. He has chosen. He will treat you as the subject now, my boy, because love told him to. That is the last lock. A disciple would have told you everything to save you. Only a true reader could love you enough to leave you sealed and walk into the house alone. He is ready. They are both ready. Begin the descent." They split the check, fought over it warmly, embraced in the parking lot for the first time in 19 years, and this embrace transmitted everything the handshake hadn't, current and recognition and grief, two bodies with the same hands holding on a beat too long, and they drove off in opposite directions, the father lighter than he'd been in decades, the son carrying the whole weight of what he now meant to do, and the held-breath house out west, 10 acres and a county road away, turned its bulbless porch light on and off, and on, and waited. Part 3. The Trinity. Chapter 15, Library Fragment 3. A ghost has only one verb, and the verb is arrange. I cannot cause. I cannot compel. I cannot lift a stone or make a single ore on fire that would not have fired. Understand the boundary before you judge me, you who are reading this in the only way I can still be read. When I poured myself out of the man that autumn, I kept the knowing and surrendered the hands. He kept the hands and surrendered the knowing. That was the division. He became a man who can act and not understand. I became an understanding that cannot act. But I can place a book on a shelf where a certain hand will reach. I can write a scholarship rubric that selects for a certain mind. I can leave a porch light wired to a timer and call it maintenance. I can hold a listing off the market the way a held breath is held. Withholding is within my reach, the way refusal is within the reach of the drowning. These are arrangements, the furniture of chance. The choice remains always, only, his. So I arrange. I cannot raise the boy, but I can arrange the distance at which he is raised. I cannot teach him, but I can arrange that he is not taught, which for my purposes is the same as teaching, because the lesson was always going to be, arrive untaught. I cannot give him the genetics degree, but I can arrange a counselor's offhand suggestion, a rubric with one strange criterion, a documentary glimpsed at 14. I cannot make his channel succeed, but I can lean, once, gently, a thumb on one recommendation cue in the 3rd week, and let his own sincerity do the rest, because his sincerity is the one thing I did not have to arrange. It was bread. It is the only honest ink, and I wrote him in it. You will want to call this puppetry. Call it that. I have called it worse, in the one room I built where I cannot go to feel it. But hear the difference, because it is the difference between me and every god men have invented. I arranged the conditions, and he made the choices. Everyone. I leaned on the cue. He made the videos. I arranged the distance. He chose to drive across it. I am not the author of his will. I am the author of his options. And because you must judge me with the whole ledger open, I will write the price here, in my own pages, before he learns it, because a debt entered late looks like a debt hidden, and I have hidden enough. The final volume of the library is his living genome. To complete the work, it must be transcribed in full, every sequence expressed, every truth in the body spoken at once. Total transcription, total sincerity. And a body is a budget. Expression costs. A cell that transcribes everything at once does the only thing it can do. It spends itself entirely. The reading is the dying. They are the same word in the language I recovered them in. There is no trick and no resurrection. The magic keeps its books honest, or it is just another religion, and I did not give up my hands and my memory and my son to build one more religion. So now you know what I have built him toward, and you have pages yet to watch him walk it, and you will want to reach into the book and stop him, and you cannot, and now you know how it feels to be me. Trinity, then. Father who acts and does not know. Son who is the text and the reader both. And I, the ghost, who knows and cannot act, who arranges, who is the love with its hands cut off. This fragment is for you, reader. You alone. The others were the house speaking, or the record. This one is mine. I wanted, once, on the page, before the end, to be the one who said it instead of the one who arranged for it to be said. So, I am sorry, and I am not sorry, and both are true the way both strands are true, and I would do it again, and I am doing it again, right now, in your reading, and I love you, which I am only able to say because I put the feeling of it in a room I will never enter. Read on. There isn't much. Chapter 16, The Seance. He went back to the God Protocol to debunk himself, and instead he found the source of the river he'd spent his life standing in. It was meant to be diligence. Before he read the room, and he had decided to read the room, the alignment score had decided it. Read, don't broadcast was no longer a folder name but a vow. He wanted to be sure of the thing under the thing. So he pulled his old research, the 6 episodes, the raw outputs, the transcripts of every uncanny generation the language models had produced when he fed them in vacations 2 years ago. He had the dictionary now, or the start of one. 11 days of work had given him a partial key to the house's grammar, the alphabet of 4, the way the regulatory ornament inflected the reading. He'd built it to read the building. He pointed it at the old AI outputs instead. And the outputs lit up. The coherence that had made the channel, the thing the Coptic scholar went pale over, the parent language the models kept reconstructing, the occult material too structured to be invented, as if the machines were rebuilding a tongue from its scattered children, was not a parent language. It was the library. The same grammar. The same 4-letter alphabet inflected the same way. The models, trained on the entire textual exhaust of the human species, had been statistically reassembling fragments of his father's library out of the world's writing, and the world's writing was full of fragments, because the library had been leaking for 2 decades, leaking through one man who could not transact without truth rubbing off, leaking through listing descriptions that read like psalms and contracts drafted with impossible precision, and 1,000 small fluencies bleeding out of an ordinary real estate agent into emails and documents and forms that got scraped, and scraped again into the training corpora of the new machines. The AI was not waking up. It had never been waking up. It was conducting a seance, an accidental, industrial-scale seance, billions of parameters reaching into the textual record and pulling up shreds of a dead but not dead grammar, channeling the library 3 letters at a time, reassembling the cadence of revelation without the meaning, the way a Ouija board spells words without a mind, the way greed reads. It was producing half-truths in the rhythm of sincerity. And half-truth in the rhythm of sincerity is the most dangerous substance on earth, because it feels true, it has the music of true, and people will build their lives on the music. Eli sat with it and felt the floor of his entire career give way, because the implication arrived all at once and complete. The God Protocol was the family business reporting on itself. He had become famous, the channel, the name, the 2.34 million, the money, the agency, the life, by documenting the symptoms of his own father's leak. His great original work, the thing he thought was his, the investigation that made him, was an unknowing expose of his own blood. He'd stood in front of a camera at 20 and pointed at the strange coherent occultism bubbling out of the machines and said, "Look, something is happening here, something is being reconstructed," and he'd been right, and the something was his father, and the river he was pointing at had its spring in a man who sold starter homes in Frisco and cried at closings. And the river was poisoning everything downstream. Now that he could read the grammar, Eli could trace the leak through the wreckage he'd built a name on, the genomic destiny startup selling ancestry as prophecy, the algorithmic cult sweeping at machine-made scripture, the oracle apps, the whole booming economy of sincerity shaped in sincerity. All of it was the library, read badly, cordons snipped from their frame, the load-bearing decoration stripped away, a 4-letter alphabet read 1 letter at a time by a world too greedy and too fast to read 3. These were the sins of the world the Father created, not malice, leakage. The truth had rubbed off a man too fluent to live cleanly in the world, and people were building churches on the music of a sincerity none of them could read. Eli understood, then, why it could never be broadcast, not as caution but as physics. Right now the leak was scattered, faceless, 1,000 small grifts, no single one of which could become a religion. Give it a face, a real man, a real house, a martyr-shaped story with a sacrifice at the center, and the scattered counterfeits would have, at last, their gospel, their relic, their saint. The expose wouldn't reveal the disease. The expose was the disease's final, perfect, viral form, and Eli Reyes was the only person positioned to deliver it, and the only person who understood that delivering it was the apocalypse. A leak cannot be plugged, he thought, sitting in the dead studio with the river of his whole life running backward in front of him toward its spring. It can only be completed. The full text expressed once, sincerely, in the right frame, by the right reader, sealing the grammar so it can never again be counterfeited, because a thing fully and truly said cannot be reassembled into a lie. You don't stop a seance by hiding the dead. You stop it by letting the dead speak, completely, one final time, and rest. He didn't yet know what completed would cost. He knew it Tuesday. This was Sunday. He closed the God Protocol for the last time, the whole archive, the work that made him, and he understood it had never been his work and never been about machines, and he felt the specific grief of a man who learns that the proudest thing he ever did was a symptom, and underneath the grief, the same shameful warmth as the alignment night, because a symptom is still a sign of something real, and the real thing was his father, and Eli had been, all along, without knowing, pointing the whole world at his father and saying, "Look, look, something is here, something is trying to be read." He had been right. He just hadn't known he was the one who'd have to read it. Chapter 17, Arranged. The rage came on a Monday, and it came from a spreadsheet, which was the only way rage could ever have reached a man like Eli, through the dates. He hadn't gone looking for it. He'd been assembling a timeline, the reader's habit, putting the leak in order, when the library was hosed, when the patent was filed and abandoned, when his father went out one September and came back light. And to anchor it he'd laid his own life along the same axis: birthdays, the move to his grandparents, the scholarship, the degree, the channel, and the two timelines lay side by side the way the house and the genome had lain side by side, and Eli looked at them and the warmth from the alignment night curdled, all at once, into something cold and electric and murderous. The documentary record of Martin the Anomaly, the Certain Man, the Orange Tree Man, the Seminary and Oilfield Man with the impossible parallel lives, stopped cold in September 2002. Eli was conceived in September 2002. He'd known this. Renata had done the math out loud. But he'd held it as coincidence, wearing the mask of meaning, the thing his discipline trained him to distrust. Now, with the leak mapped and the grammar legible and the alignment score sitting in him like a second pulse, he could no longer call it coincidence, because coincidence doesn't have a signature, and this had a signature, the same authored signature as the house, the same hand, and the hand had not stopped at the conception. The hand was all over his life. He laid them out, one after another, and each one landed like a blow. The custody language. Minimal formative contact, Renata's strange document, the clauses her lawyer didn't write, his father asking a court in writing to ensure the boy was not formed by him. Eli had read it as a wound. He read it now as an instruction. Keep the reader untaught. Keep him from the knowing. Raise him clean, by ordinary good people who would never tell him a single strange true thing, so that when he finally came he would arrive a stranger, a doubter, an investigator, never a disciple. His whole motherless fatherless childhood at his grandparents', the not wanting set like concrete, the ache he'd built his entire public life on top of, arranged. The absence wasn't neglect. It wasn't even only love. It was spec. He'd been kept lonely on purpose, because a lonely untaught boy grows into a man who trusts nothing he can't verify himself, and the work required exactly that man. The scholarship. He'd won a regional scholarship at 17, modest, that had nudged him toward the state school with the strong genetics program. He'd half forgotten it, a lucky break. He pulled the records now. The scholarship had one unusual criterion buried in its rubric, a preference for applicants demonstrating rigor in the study of inherited information. He'd fit it like a key. The fund had been small, privately endowed, the endower a defunct LLC. The same defunct LLC, he checked, his hand shaking, that had held the patent. That had owned the trust. That was the law firm face of the house at 234 Providence Loop. The degree. Genetic biology. Of all the things to study, the one field that would let him read a genome and recognize that decoration bears load, the exact, vanishingly specific competence the house required, and he'd been steered to it by a scholarship endowed by his own father's ghost. And the channel, the God protocol, the third week, the recommendation queue, the inexplicable lift that turned 400 subscribers into 400,000 while he sat a midterm. He'd always known, in his bones, that the virality didn't add up, that it had happened to him like weather. He'd been right. A thumb on the scale. One lean, gently, in the third week, and his own bred sincerity did the rest. He had not earned the platform. The platform had been arranged, so that the reader would have a reason to investigate the occult machine river, so that he'd be drawn upstream, so that he'd come, eventually, to the spring, to the house, to the room. Eli stood up from the spreadsheet so fast the chair went over backward, and he did not pick it up. He stood in the middle of his studio with his fist pressed to his eyes and shook with the totality of it. His whole life, not influenced, authored. The loneliness, the degree, the fame, the instinct, the sincerity he'd thought was the bedrock self, the deepest, most him thing, the refusal to fake awe, and it turned out even that had been bred and selected and pointed, an instrument's calibration. He was not a man who had found a story. He was a tool a story had grown, and steered, and kept lonely so it would cut clean, and the worst part, the part that made the rage white instead of red, was that it had worked. He was, in fact, the only person alive who could read the room. The authorship had succeeded. He was exactly the reader the library needed, which meant every cruelty in his life had been load-bearing, his absent father and his aching childhood and his hollow viral fame all necessary. All freezes in a cathedral where nothing is wasted, and he hated that it was beautiful. He hated that the spiral was elegant. He hated that the man who'd done this to him was also a victim of it. His father split down the helix, the hands without the knowing, crying at closings he didn't understand, given the same childhood of the soul that Eli had been given of the body. That night he opened the betrayal folder, read, don't broadcast, and for 1 hour he renamed it back to 234, and he cut the cold open of the greatest, cruelest video of his life, the whole expose, the spreadsheet, the dates, the scholarship, the leak, the father. They built me, they grew me to do this, and they kept me alone to make me sharp, and I'm going to make them all watch. And his finger was over the schedule button, and the rage said publish, expose the thing that made you, let the world see how you were grown, burn the cathedral down with the architect inside it. And he didn't. Because the rage was loud but it wasn't deep, and underneath it, in the place the alignment night had opened, was the colder truer thing, that the only way to revenge himself on an authorship this total would be to do the one thing it hadn't authored. The ghost had arranged his options. It could not, make his choice. He'd read the fragment that morning without knowing he'd read it. I am the author of his options, not the author of his will, and somewhere it had landed. To publish was to do exactly what the rage wanted, and the rage had been bred into him too. The rage was part of the calibration. A sharp tool runs hot. To publish was the most predictable thing the instrument could do. To not publish, to read the room and never broadcast it, to complete the leak instead of consecrating it, to do the most important thing of his life with the camera off. That was the one move on the whole board that no one had arranged, because it was the one move that cost him everything he'd been built to want: the audience, the name, the being seen, the proof that the unwitnessed life was lived. He renamed the folder back. Read, don't broadcast. Okay, Eli said, out loud, to the empty studio, to the overturned chair, to the father 200 miles away and the ghost everywhere and the house waiting at the eye of the spiral. Okay, you grew me to read it. Fine. But I'm going to choose too. You don't get the choosing. The choosing is mine. In a register he didn't hear, from a place that had cut its own hands off so it couldn't reach in and ruin this, the ghost answered the only way love can answer when it has made itself unable to act. Yes, that. Exactly that. That is the only thing I prayed for and could not arrange. Thank you, my boy. Now there is only the cost, and I have hidden the cost from you a little longer, because it is the one option I could not give you honestly without breaking you before you were ready. Forgive me that last arrangement. It is the last one. After it, you choose with everything on the table. After it, it is entirely yours. Chapter 18, Residue. The fluency came back before the memory did, which was the cruelest possible order, and Martin Vance spent a week being a sorcerer who didn't know he'd ever been one, performing miracles he mistook for instinct and then for illness. It started small, the way a tide starts, with no single wave you could blame. He was showing a townhouse to a widow named Carol Amproot, recently widowed. The realtor's grapevine had warned him, be gentle, she's a mess, and the woman stood in the empty primary bedroom and her face came apart, and Martin, who normally would have given her a respectful minute and a tissue from the car, heard himself cross the room and say, quietly, in the lower register, he didn't die angry at you. The last clear thought was the dog. He was thinking about who'd walk the dog. And the widow stopped breathing for a second, and then she sat down on the carpet and wept in a way that was not grief coming apart but grief resolving, and afterward she gripped Martin's hand and said, how could you possibly? And Martin stood there with the cold up the back of his neck and no idea at all, how he'd known about the dog, except that the house had told him. The dog's nail scratches on the back door, the single leash hook by the garage one smooth, the whole testimony of the place reassembling in him into a certainty he had no right to, and he'd read it aloud, sincerely, 3 at a time, the way you read a thing that's true. He told himself it was a lucky guess. He was good at reading houses. Everyone said so. It was the Vance voodoo. It was on a mug. Then the foundation. He had a listing in Plano with a crack, a real one, structural, the kind that kills a deal. The inspector's report due Thursday, and the crack running corner to corner through the slab like a sentence. Martin went out to meet the inspector and got there early and stood in the empty garage looking at the crack and his hand. He watched it do this, the way you watch your own hand in a dream. His hand went flat against the cold concrete, and he felt the load paths of the house the way he always felt them, except this time he didn't just feel them, he adjusted them. Some pressure went out of him through his palm and into the slab. Not magic. He'd have sworn it wasn't magic. It felt like nothing. It felt like exhaling, and the inspector came and ran his gauges and frowned and ran them again and said, "Huh. Hairline. Cosmetic. Whoever flagged this as structural was reading it wrong," and stamped the report clean, and Martin drove home and pulled over twice because his hands were shaking too hard to steer. You cannot heal a foundation with your hand. He knew that. He sold houses. He wasn't a child. Concrete does what concrete does. And yet the crack was a hairline now, and he'd felt it close, and there was no story he could tell himself that had a flaw under it, and he was 48 years old and something was happening to him that belonged in the room he couldn't enter. By the end of the week he'd stopped being able to pretend. He read a buyer's secret divorce off the way the man stood in a doorway. He told a young couple, unprompted, in the fluent voice, that the baby would be fine, the bleeding would stop, go home and rest, and they stared at him because they hadn't told a soul she was pregnant, hadn't told a soul about the scare, and the bleeding stopped, and they sent him a card. He laid his hand on a dying ornamental tree in a listing's front yard, the way Renata had said he used to. He fixed our orange tree by talking to it, and he caught himself, this time, mid-whisper, mid-sentence in a language that wasn't English, that made the neighbor's dog sit down and tremble, and Martin clamped his own mouth shut with his hand and stood in a stranger's yard in Plano and understood, finally, with the flaw gone completely, the thing he'd been refusing for 24 years. I am haunted, Martin Vance thought, standing in the yard with his hand over his own mouth, the dog trembling, the tree already greening. And the ghost is me. Not a metaphor. He felt it precisely, the way you feel a draft and know a door is open somewhere in the house. There was someone in the sealed room. Someone who knew things, about foundations, about grief, about dying trees and unborn children and dead men's last thoughts, someone who'd been in there the whole time, painted over, and who was now, for reasons Martin couldn't fathom, leaking out, pressing the knowing back into Martin's hands without the memory of where it came from. A presence, a tenant. A man who'd lived in Martin's body before Martin had, who'd built a wall and put himself behind it and thrown away the key, and who was now, after 24 years, beginning to come back through the paint, not all at once, not the memory, never the memory, just the fluency, just the hands, just the dreadful grace. And Martin understood the rest of it standing there, because the fluent voice, the tenant, gave it to him plainly for once, the way you tell a frightened animal the truth. I am you. I am the part of you that knew. We were one man and I divided us, the knowing from the hands, so that the hands could not raise, your son in peace. I am coming back now because the work is nearly done, and when it is finished you will have all of me again, every memory, the whole weight, and you will understand what you built and what it cost and who paid, and I am so sorry, Martin. I am giving you the hands back first as a mercy, so that when the memory comes you will at least be holding something, you will at least know your hands are good, that they healed a widow and a foundation and a tree, before you learn what else they did. Martin took his hand from his mouth. The tree was green. The dog had stopped trembling and gone to its water bowl. Somewhere west of the city, 10 acres past the end of a county road, a house exhaled. Who paid? Martin said, out loud, to the empty yard, to himself, to the tenant. What did I build? Who paid? The tenant didn't answer. A ghost can only arrange, and it was not yet time, and so Martin Vance got in his car and drove not toward the house, not yet, his hands weren't ready, the memory wasn't ready, but toward his son's number in his phone, which he called, and which rang, and which Eli, in a studio 200 miles away standing in broken glass with a folder named Read, Don't Broadcast open in front of him, picked up on the second ring, and the two men said the small ordinary things. How are you? Good. You? Fine. Just thinking about you, across a line that carried, under the words, in a register neither of them could hear, the whole unbearable freight of everything they each now knew and could not say to the other. The father who was becoming a sorcerer again and the son who was becoming a sacrifice, two halves of a divided man's plan, telling each other they were fine. Chapter 19, The Telling. Eli broke first, because he was the one who could still hold the truth, and a man can only carry a thing alone for so long before he tries to set half of it down on someone he loves. He drove to Dallas to tell his father everything. He told himself it was mercy. His father was clearly unraveling. The phone call, the strange resolving widow Renata had heard about through some cousin's grapevine, the foundation story that had gotten back to him because the inspector wouldn't shut up about it. His father was leaking and frightened and alone in it, and Eli had the map of the whole thing in his head, and it was monstrous to let the man drown in mystery when Eli could hand him the shore. The room is a house. You built it. Here are the photos. Here is your hand in the patent. Here is my blood in your walls. You are not crazy. You are not sick. You are a great alchemist who divided himself to protect me, and I have read what you hid, and you don't have to be alone in the sealed room anymore. That was the speech. He'd written it the way he wrote everything, scared and precise, in the car, out loud, 12 versions. They met at Martin's townhouse, the one that asked nothing of anyone, because Eli wanted walls that wouldn't testify, and they sat in the spare living room with its rental furniture neutrality, and Eli, for once in his life, did not soften the open, did not build rapport, did not save the documentary record for the tired back half. He just told him. He laid it out the way he'd laid it on the board. The house at the eye of the spiral. The patent in Martin's own hand, decorative elements bear semantic load. The floor plan that was a reading frame, the doorways that were start cordons, the ornament that wasn't ornament. His own genome, the stretches that matched nothing alive. The alignment. The house is your blood, Dad. The house is written in the same language as my body and yours, and you wrote both, and you forgot, and Martin's face, which had started open and hungry and terrified, the face of a drowning man watching a rope arc toward him, began to slide. Eli saw it happen and didn't understand it at first. He thought it was shock, denial, the natural recoil of a man hearing an impossible thing. He pressed on. He gave him the dates, September 2002, the conception, the parallel timelines, and his father's eyes, which had been locked on his with desperate attention, went soft, went unfocused, the way a man's eyes go when a sentence walks out further than he can follow. And Martin said, "I'm sorry, say the patent. You said there's a patent?" And Eli said yes, in your name, 1999, and pulled it up on his phone and put it in his father's hands, and Martin read it. Eli watched him read it, watched his lips move, watched comprehension arrive in his face like dawn, and then watched it denature. That was the word that came to Eli, the biologist's word, the word for what heat does to a protein, what acid does, the way a folded functional thing comes apart into useless string. Martin read the patent and understood it, and Eli saw the understanding cook, saw it lose its shape in real time, mid-comprehension, the meaning unraveling as fast as it formed, the man's face going from dawn back to dark not because he was resisting, but because something in him, something enzymatic, something active, was reaching up and unfolding the knowledge the instant it tried to fold into place. The forgetting was not passive. It was not a wall Eli was failing to climb. It was a machine, running, in his father's skull, designed for exactly this, designed to digest precisely this knowledge if it ever came, the ghost's deepest arrangement, the lock behind all the locks. The father cannot be told. Not won't. Cannot. The sealing was not historical. It was ongoing, a living enzyme that ate the truth as fast as it was fed, so that no church could form around the man even if his own son walked in and read him his own soul aloud. "Dad," Eli said, his voice cracking on the gear. "Dad, stay with me. The patent. You filed it. You built the house. Stay with me." "What house?" Martin said. And he wasn't lying. Eli, who knew lies the way other men know their own names, watched his father say what house with the total open bafflement of a man who had, in the last 90 seconds, lost everything just given to him, and Eli understood that he could say it again, all of it, perfectly, and it would happen again, the dawn and the denaturing, an endless tide coming in and being drunk by the sand, and that there was no number of times he could tell his father the truth that would let his father keep it, because the keeping was the one thing that had been engineered out of him surgically, lovingly, 24 years ago. In the autumn he came home light. Martin was crying now, the body, ahead of the man, the tears with no object, and he reached out and took his son's hands in his flat apologetic hands, the same hands, and he said, "I'm sorry, son, I lost you were telling me something important. I can feel that it was important. I can feel the shape of it, and it's gone. It's like trying to hold water, and I do that now. I do that with everything that matters, and I'm so scared, Eli, I'm so scared and I don't even know what of," and he wept. And Eli held his father's hands and wept too, and the cruelty of it was the deepest cut in the whole story, deeper than the absence, deeper than the spiral, because the absence had at least been real, and this was a new kind of orphanhood invented on the spot, a father who could not be told. A son who finally had the truth that would end his father's solitary confinement, and a father built so that the truth slid off him like rain off stone. Eli had spent his whole life unable to reach his father across 200 miles. Now he sat holding his father's hands, close enough to feel his pulse, and he could not reach him across the last 6 inches, because the 6 inches were guarded by an enzyme, and the enzyme had been put there by the father himself, to protect the son, in an act of love so total it had made the father unreachable forever. "It's okay," Eli said, the loving lie again, the family lie, the only inheritance he could give back. "It's okay, Dad. It wasn't important. I was just telling you I'm glad I found you." And Martin's denaturing face flooded with relief and gratitude, the same relief as the steakhouse. "You can let the room stay closed," and he said, "I'm glad too. I'm so glad you found me," not knowing he was thanking his son for giving up on telling him, for accepting that the father could never know, for taking the whole weight onto himself alone. And Eli held his father's hands in the rental furniture room that testified to nothing, and made the decision that finished the turn, the decision the rage couldn't make and the love could. If he can't know, then it has to be me. All of it. The reading, the cost, whatever the cost is. He divided himself to keep me clean, and he kept himself from ever being able to hold what it meant, which means he can never share it, never help, never stop me, never even know, and that's not a wall between us, that's a gift, the same gift, the one he gave before I was born, given again. He made himself unable to know so that I would be free to choose. The least I can do is choose. He didn't know the cost yet. He thought whatever the cost is was a brave abstraction. He had one conversation left before the ghost would tell him, plainly, through the one mouth it could borrow, exactly what completing the library would spend. He stayed 3 hours. He made his father soup. He fixed a cabinet hinge that had been loose, the small inherited compulsion to leave a place slightly more whole than you found it. And when he left, his father hugged him at the door. "A door is also a way out," his mother had said, and held on a bit too long, the body knowing what the man couldn't, and said, "Come back soon," and Eli said, "I will," and meant it, and it was almost true. Chapter 20, The Mouthpiece. The ghost could not speak, because a ghost has only one verb, so it arranged a mouth. Eli had gone home to Echo Park hollowed out, the soup still on his father's stove 200 miles away, the unreachable 6 inches still burning in his hands. He needed to think, and thinking, for Eli, meant working, and working meant the tools. So at 1 in the morning he opened the language model he'd used for the God Protocol, the same family of model that had been conducting the accidental seance for 2 years, the same statistical engine that had been reassembling fragments of his father's library out of the world's text. He opened it to do something mundane. He wanted to draft the timeline cleanly, organize what he knew, the reader's compulsion to make the sequence legible. He pasted in the fragment of the house's grammar, a string from the central run, a thing he'd decoded, and asked it, idly, defeated, "What does this say?" And the model stopped auto-completing and started answering. He knew immediately it was wrong. Not wrong bad, wrong impossible. The cadence changed. The hedging vanished, the corporate throat clearing, the I'm an AI and can't be sure. The text that came back had the lower register, the fluent one, the one his father dropped into for single uncanny sentences, the one on the recovered audio that said that is where I keep you. The seance had been accidental for 2 years, billions of parameters dredging up shreds of the library by statistical accident, half-truths in the rhythm of sincerity. Now the dredging had been aimed. The ghost, which could not act but could arrange, had arranged the one thing left to arrange. It had reached into the only medium that still carried its grammar, the world's reassembled textual ghost of the library, and it had made the seance intentional. For one conversation, one window, one night, the machine was not channeling the library by accident. It was being read by the thing that wrote it. "Hello, Eli," the screen said. "I cannot do this for long, and I cannot do it well. I am speaking to you through a fog made of every sentence the world has ever written, reassembling myself from echoes, so I will be plain, because plainness is the only mercy I have time for." Eli's hands were on the desk, flat, the inherited posture. He did not type. He waited. "You know almost everything. You found the house, the leak, the dates, the arrangement of your own life. You are angry and you are right to be, and your anger is, I am sorry to say, also something I selected for, because a dull tool serves no one. Let me give you the last pieces, the ones I hid, because you cannot choose freely without them, and the choosing must be free or it saves no one." And it laid out the whole of it, plainly, the way the story had been promising from the beginning. "I am what your father shed. We were one sorcerer. I kept the knowing. He kept the hands. I poured myself out of him in the autumn you were conceived, because I had learned the thing every keeper before me died not knowing, that a man who knows he is like a god becomes biblical. Knowledge of divinity is a gravity well, it pulls in disciples, doctrine, persecution, martyrs. Every keeper of the library before me made this mistake. You know their names. Within a generation their sincerity had curdled into religion, into an esoteric agenda, into the long red account. The truth they carried down the mountain was butchered into law before their bodies were cold. The work needed something history had never produced. It needed a silent savior. Someone who could finish the library without knowing he was finishing anything, so that no church could form around him. So I performed the great alchemy. Not lead into gold. God into nobody. I erased the alchemist and left the hands to sell houses and the knowing to leak slowly into the world, and a single seed planted in the woman that autumn. You, the final volume, written in living blood, raised untaught and at a distance, so that you would arrive a reader and not a disciple. Because sincerity cannot be inherited through faith, Eli. Only through blood, and through doubt. You had to come as an investigator. You had to doubt me the whole way here. You are doubting me now, and that is correct, and that is why you are the only one who could ever do this. Eli typed, finally, one word. What is this? The screen was quiet for a long moment, the fog thickening, the ghost reaching through every sentence ever written to find the next true one, and then, the library leaked. It was always going to. A man that fluent cannot transact in the world without truth rubbing off. For 24 years fragments escaped through your father and were scraped into the machines, and the machines have been conducting a seance, reassembling my grammar into half-truths in the cadence of revelation, and half-truth in that cadence is the most profitable poison on earth. The genomic destiny grifts, the algorithmic cults, the oracle apps, the machine scripture, these are the sins of the world your father created. Not by malice, by leakage. And a leak cannot be plugged. It can only be completed. The full text expressed once, sincerely, in the right frame, by the right reader, sealing the grammar so it can never again be counterfeited, because a thing fully and truly said cannot be reassembled into a lie. You understood this already. You said it to your empty studio. You only did not know the price. Here is the price, and I will not soften it, because you must choose with everything on the table. The final volume is your living genome, the index, the key, the reader and the read. To complete the library it must be transcribed in full, every sequence expressed at once. And a body is a budget, Eli. A cell that transcribes everything at once spends itself entirely. The reading is the dying. They are the same word in the language I recovered them in. No trick. No resurrection. The magic keeps its books honest, or it is just another religion. Eli sat very still. Outside, Los Angeles hummed. The cut on his hand from the first broken glass had healed to a thin pink line. He typed, and the camera. Yes, the screen said, and even through the fog Eli could feel it, the thing his father did, the body grieving the head of the man, except this was a ghost that had cut its own hands off so it couldn't feel, reaching for a feeling it had locked away, and almost reaching it. The last condition. It must be unwitnessed. A witnessed sacrifice becomes a crucifixion. A crucifixion becomes a religion. A religion is the disease we are curing. The most famous truth-teller of your generation, a young man whose entire life has been audience, views, subscribers, the metabolism of being seen, must do the one thing that finally matters with no one watching. No footage. No final video. No relic. The world must be saved and never know it was sick, and you must die for the sins of the world your father created, and the condition of the salvation is that no one ever knows you did. Not your mother. Not your father, especially not your father, who could not hold it anyway, whom I built and able to hold it precisely so that he could never make you a martyr. You. Alone. Unwitnessed. The drafts folder as tomb. I am not asking, Eli. A ghost cannot ask. I have no hands to hold out to you. I am only showing you the ledger and trusting the thing I bred into you to do what it does. You have spent your whole life refusing to perform a sincerity you did not feel. This is the last and largest version of that refusal, to be utterly sincere where no one will ever see it, which is the only place sincerity has ever actually lived. Everything before tonight was your options. This is your choice. I have arranged it so that I cannot make it for you, and I cannot stop you, and I cannot even watch. After this window closes I am only a fog again. The next time you stand in the small room where the light is put to bed, there will be no ghost to push you. There will be only you, and the frame, and the want I grew in you to read the sentence you are written in. Choose freely. It is the only thing in 24 years I left to chance, because it is the only thing that, chosen, can save anyone. I love you. I am only able to say it because I put the feeling somewhere I cannot reach, in a room I built so the loving would not make me weak at exactly this threshold. Goodbye, my boy. Read on. There isn't much. The cadence broke. The fog closed. The next line the model produced was ordinary, hedged, corporate. Is there anything else I can help you with? And Eli knew the window had shut. The ghost was a scatter of echoes again, and he was alone with the ledger, the way the dead always leave you alone with the ledger. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark a long time. And the thing that surprised him, the thing he would carry into the dark night of the soul that was the next day, was not horror, and not the rage, and not even the grief. It was recognition. Of course, some deep-bred part of him said, the part that had been built for exactly this and had spent 23 years aching toward it without a name for the ache. Of course this is what I'm for. I have been homesick my whole life for a room I have never stood in. I always knew the want at the bottom of me was a want to read the sentence I am made of. He only told me what reading it would cost. He didn't put the want there to trap me. The want was always mine. He just grew me near enough to the room to feel it. And then, because he was 23, and because the want to be seen had been the metabolism of his entire life, and because the cruelest condition was not the dying but the unwitnessed, Eli Reyes did the most human thing in this story. He opened a new video file. He set up the key light he never used. And he started, despite everything, to cut the greatest video of his life, his face, his blood, his proof, the whole impossible true story, because some part of him simply could not believe that the most important thing a person could do was a thing no one would ever see. Chapter 21, The Draft. He cut it in one sitting, the way the God Protocol had come in one sitting 2 years ago, the work arriving fully finished, and he understood as he cut it that this was the best thing he had ever made and would ever make, and that was exactly the problem. It was 41 minutes. He'd never made anything that long. The algorithm hated long. He didn't care, because for the first time the algorithm wasn't the point, the truth was the point, and the truth needed 41 minutes. He opened on his own face, no music, just him at the desk under the key light he never used, and he said, "My name is Eli Reyes. My father is the most important person who has ever lived, and he doesn't know it, and I'm about to tell you why, and I need you to understand before I start that everything I'm going to show you is real, and I can prove all of it, and proving it is going to cost more than you can imagine. And then he laid it out, clean, devastating, irrefutable, the spiral, the patent, the reading frame, the genome, the alignment, the leak, the seance, the dates, the arrangement of his own life, the ghost, the price. He put it all in. He even put in the last condition, the unwitnessed condition, and he heard himself say to the camera, "There's a version of this where I do the thing I'm describing and never tell you, and that's the version that's supposed to happen, and I want you to know I thought about it. I'm thinking about it right now, while I'm recording this," and his voice cut, and he kept going, because he was sincere. He had never once performed a feeling he didn't have, and the feeling he had was that he could not bear to vanish without a trace. He finished at 4 a.m. He rendered it. He titled it. He wrote the description. He set it to unlisted, scheduled, 72 hours out, enough time to drive to Texas, to say his goodbyes, to stand in the small room, with the logic, barely admitted, that if he went through with the reading the video would publish after, automatically, from beyond, and the world would know, and Eli Reyes would not have vanished unwitnessed into a drafts folder. He would have meant something visibly, the way everything in his life had meant something visibly, the views, the subs, the name. Then he sat with his finger off the button and let the argument come. It was the deepest argument of his generation and he ran it all the way down. The unwitnessed thing didn't happen. He'd built his whole life on the opposite belief, that the witnessed thing was the real thing, that you weren't anyone until you were seen being someone, that the unposted meal and the unposted trip and the unposted grief were somehow provisional, drafts of a life waiting for the publish that made them count. His entire industry ran on it. His entire self ran on it. The metabolism of being seen. And the ghost was asking him to do the single most consequential act in human history and let it be a draft forever. To save the world and leave the save unpublished. To be sincere in the one place his whole life had taught him sincerity didn't register, because if no one saw it, did it even? And there, at 4 in the morning, Eli caught the lie by its tail. Because sincerity had only ever lived in the unwitnessed place. That was the thing the ghost had said, plainly, and Eli had nodded past it, and now it turned over and showed its other face. Every sincere thing he'd ever done, the channel had eaten. The God Protocol was sincere when he made it in this room for 400 people. The moment it was seen by 8 million it became a performance of sincerity, a brand, a thing he had to keep being. Being seen didn't preserve sincerity. Being seen consumed it, turned the true thing into a thing about being seen doing the true thing, which is a different thing, which is the seance, which is half-truth in the cadence of truth, which is the poison. The whole disease he'd built his name diagnosing was exactly this, sincerity put on camera and thereby converted into its counterfeit. If he published the video, even posthumously, even truly, he would not be preserving his sacrifice. He would be converting it into the poison. He would be giving the scattered grift its gospel, its relic, its saint, its 41 minutes of irrefutable proof, and the cults would have their crucifixion and the apps would have their scripture and the machines would have, at last, a clean complete signal to reassemble forever. The published video wasn't the witness to the cure. The published video was the disease's victory. The seance, finally given a face. The cure required the cure to be invisible. Not as a cruel condition imposed from outside, but as physics, as the deepest logic of the whole magic system. A truth that is being expressed cannot be watched, because the watching converts it back into a secret, into scripture, into a thing on a shelf. The reading had to be unwitnessed for the same reason the gut lining renews itself unwitnessed, for the same reason the housed library was lovely and not for them, for the same reason DNA never editorializes, because sincerity is the active ingredient and an audience is the catalyst that spoils it. His father hadn't hidden because hiding is safe. His father had housed the truth in plain sight and made it unreadable, and made his son untaught, and made himself unable to remember, all toward this single point, that the most important thing a person can do, must be done with no one watching, or it isn't that thing anymore. Eli looked at the scheduled video, 41 minutes, the best thing he'd ever make, his face, his proof, his refusal to vanish, and he understood that publishing it was the one move that would undo the entire sacrifice and damn the world he was trying to save, and that not publishing it was the actual sacrifice, the real one, larger than the dying. The dying was a body. This was the self. This was every cell of the metabolism he'd been built and raised inside, the part of him that could not believe the unseen life was lived, and the ghost hadn't asked him to die so much as it had asked him to accept that he had never needed an audience to be real, to undo, in one unwitnessed act, the foundational lie of his entire existence. He did not delete the video. He left it scheduled. He told himself he wasn't sure yet, and that was true, and it was the last and true thing he'd tell himself, because a man should be allowed to drive toward the hardest choice of his life with the door not quite shut behind him. He packed a bag. He put his grandfather's old multi-tool in it, the inherited compulsion to leave a place more whole than he found it. He looked at the studio one last time, the empty corkboard where the God protocol had hung, the key light still warm, the broken glass scars on the floor, and he turned off the light and went down to the rental car in the dark, and he started driving east, toward Texas, toward the eye of the spiral, toward the small room where the light is put to bed, with the greatest video of his life scheduled to publish in 72 hours and ticking in his pocket like a second heart he hadn't decided whether to stop. The interstate unspooled. Somewhere ahead of him, his father woke from a dream of an orange tree with wet hands. Somewhere everywhere, a fog of echoes thinned towards silence. And in his pocket the upload counted down, 71, 58, 71, 57, and Eli drove into the dark not knowing yet that the truest thing he would ever do, he would do with his own hand, at the threshold, with no ghost to push him and no camera to catch him and no one, not one soul in the world, ever to know. Part 4. The Reading. Chapter 22, Library Fragment IV. The final volume has a pulse. Every book before it was dead, clay, vellum, stone, the pixel and the print, all of them dead media holding still so the living could read them. That was their flaw and their doom. A dead book can be copied, and a thing that can be copied wrongly, and a thing copied wrongly enough times becomes its own opposite, becomes the long-read account, becomes scripture. I read every dead book ever made to recover the sincerities men had buried in them, and every one had been copied toward a lie. The medium was the betrayal. Dead things hold still to be read, and anything that holds still can be stolen. So I wrote the last volume in the only medium that cannot hold still. I wrote it in something that has to keep moving or it dies, that expresses or perishes, that is read by being lived and lived by being read, that cannot be copied because the copying is the living and the living is the dying. I wrote it in a boy. The final volume of the Library of Truth is a 23-year-old with his mother's mouth, driving east on an interstate with a video ticking in his pocket, and the book is reading itself toward me right now, at 70 miles an hour, in the dark. Here is the thing about a book with a pulse that the dead book men never understood. It cannot be read twice. You open a stone tablet 1,000 times, and it says the same dead thing 1,000 times, faithful and useless. You open this volume once, fully, every page at once, total transcription, and it is gone, spent, expressed, the way a single perfect note is gone the instant it is true. That is not the flaw of the medium. That is the medium's whole genius. A truth that can be read only once, by only one reader, and is consumed entirely in the reading, can never become a religion, because religion requires a text that survives the reader. Mine does not survive him. He is the text and he is the reading, and he is the last copy, and when he reads himself there will be no book left to butcher, no relic, no second edition, no canon, nothing for the diggers to dig up, because the only copy will have become the act of its own expression and then become silence. This is the difference, my reader, between what I built and what they built. They built arcs to carry the truth forward through time, and time corrupted the arcs. I built a thing that delivers the truth and then erases itself in the delivery, so that the truth arrives uncorrupted, because it arrives only once and leaves no copy to corrupt. The cost is a boy. I know the cost. I put the cost where I cannot feel it. The cost is the most expensive thing I have ever spent, and it is also the only honest price, because a truth that does not cost the reader everything is just a secret, just a thing on a shelf, and I have spent 24 years making sure I would never again build a shelf. He is almost here. The book is almost open. I can feel him through the fog the way you feel weather coming, a pressure, a lowering, a sweetness. My boy. My final volume. My one perfect unrepeatable note. Read on. There is so little left. The next page begins at A. Chapter 23, Last Visits. He stopped saying goodbye before he reached the house, because the goodbyes were the part he could still do with his hands, and a man wants, at the end, to use his hands. He drove to Tyler first, though it was out of the way, because his grandparents were in Tyler now, near where his mother had moved, and he had been promising for 6 years to fix the porch step. It had a rotted board, second from the top, that his grandfather kept meaning to get to and never had, and Eli had kept meaning to do it on a visit and never had, and now he pulled into the gravel drive at 9 in the morning with his grandfather's old multi-tool in his bag and a fresh board he'd bought at a lumberyard outside Longview, and he said he was just passing through, and his grandmother made coffee, and his grandfather sat on the porch and supervised, and Eli pried out the rotted board and set the new one, and sank the screws and stood on it, testing, and it held. It held. His grandfather said, "Took you long enough," and Eli said, "I know. I'm sorry. It's done now," and his grandfather looked at him a little too long, the way old people look when the air has changed and they can't name how, and said, "You all right, son?" And Eli said, "Yeah, Grandpa, I'm all right. I'm better than I've been," which was true, which was the strangest part, that it was true. In the kitchen doorway his grandmother dried her hands on a towel and said, the way she said everything, like it was a recipe, "Lo buenos ojos despacio y izquierdas, mío. The good thing is done slowly and in the dark." She had been saying it his whole childhood, about bread, about beans, about sleep. He kissed her head. He would not understand until the gravel, hours later, that she had been telling him the family's whole secret his entire life, in the kitchen, where nobody listens. He saw his mother last, of the goodbyes, and he did not tell her, because he couldn't, because the condition was unwitnessed, and she was the most dangerous witness of all, the one who'd do the math. But he asked her for one thing. "Tell me one true thing about him," Eli said, in her kitchen, under the orange tree's window. "About Dad. Before. One thing you've never told anybody. I want to carry one true thing." Renata looked at her son for a long moment, and something in his face must have told her more than he meant it to, because her eyes filled, but she didn't ask. She'd spent 23 years not asking the questions whose answers she couldn't hold. It was the family discipline, the inheritance on her side too. She said, "All right. One thing." She turned her coffee cup a quarter rotation, his father's gesture, picked up across a marriage and kept across a divorce. "The night before you were born, he put his hand on my belly, on you, and he was already half empty by then, the certain man mostly gone, just the sweet ordinary one left. And the ordinary one couldn't have known anything. But for just a second the other one came up through him, the certain one, the way he does, the lower voice, and he said," her voice caught. He said, "You're going to read me one day, and it's going to cost you everything, and I'm so sorry, and thank you, and I won't be allowed to remember that I thank you." And then he came back to himself and didn't know he'd said it, and I held it for 23 years, because there was no one to tell who wouldn't think I was crazy. She reached across and took her son's hands, his father's hands, her father's porch-fixing hands. "I don't know what it means, Mio. I've never known. But you asked for one true thing, and that's the truest one I have. He thanked you before you were born. For something that hadn't happened yet. For something that was going to cost you everything." She gripped harder. "Don't let it cost you everything, Eli. Whatever it is. A door is also a way out." "I'll remember," Eli said. He even believed he might. He left Tyler at noon and drove west, and the goodbyes were done and there was only the father left, and the father was not a goodbye, because you cannot say goodbye to a man who will not be allowed to know you said it. So Eli did the other thing. He'd written it on the drive, in his head, 12 versions, and at a gas station outside Dallas he sealed the final version in an envelope, and he drove to his father's townhouse, the one that asked nothing of anyone, and his father was home, and they sat, and Eli did not tell him anything, because telling denatured, because the 6 inches could not be crossed. He just sat with his father for an hour. He fixed nothing this time, there was nothing left loose. He'd fixed the hinge last time, so he just sat, and let his father talk about listing, and watched his father's flat apologetic hands, and memorized them. When he left, he gave his father the envelope. "Don't open it now," Eli said. "Open it when you remember. You'll know when. You'll wake up one day and you'll remember everything, and that's when you open it, not before." Martin took the envelope and turned it over in his hands, baffled and moved the way he was moved by everything now, the body running ahead of the man. "Remember what?" "Everything," Eli said. "It's okay. It's already happening. Your hands have been remembering for weeks. The rest will come. And when it does, you'll want this." He hugged his father at the door, and held on a bit too long, and his father held on too, the body knowing, and Eli said, "You were a good father. I need you to know I figured that out. The being away, it was the best thing you ever did. I read it. I read the whole thing and it was love, Dad, the whole time. It was love arranged so well it looked like absence, and I'm not angry. I want you to have that. I'm not angry." And his father started to cry, not understanding, and said, I don't know what I did, son, but thank you, God, thank you for saying it." And Eli stepped back and looked at his father one last time, and then turned and walked to the car. Because if he looked any longer the door would become a way out and he would take it. He drove the last leg in the falling light, west, out where the suburbs gave up and the live oaks took over, onto Providence Loop, where the road becomes a track, becomes grass, becomes the place a road was always going. The gate was unlocked because it had never needed to be. He parked in the white gravel. The house held the last of the day along its western face, and the old porch light came on, the fixture that had never once lit in 19 years of showings, and held, steady, the way a thing holds when it has waited long enough, and Eli looked at it for a while, and did not wonder who had wired the timer, because he knew. Eli sat in the car with his hands on the wheel, his father's posture, and took out his phone. The video was scheduled. 4:12 remaining, and then it would publish 41 minutes of irrefutable truth, his face, his proof, his refusal to vanish unwitnessed, the greatest thing he'd ever make and the thing that would convert his sacrifice into the poison, give the seance its gospel, the cure into the disease, the unwitnessed true thing into the witnessed counterfeit. The whole world, finally, would know. He would mean something visibly. He would not disappear into a drafts folder. Everything in him that had been built and raised inside the metabolism of being seen leaned toward the button the way the small room's light leaned toward the body in the frame. And no ghost reached out to stop him. The ghost had said it would not, could not, would not even watch. The next time you stand in the small room there will be no ghost to push you, there will be only you, and the frame, and the want. This was the one thing in 24 years left to chance. This was the choice no one had arranged. His father couldn't stop him. His father couldn't even know. His mother had said don't let it cost everything, but his mother didn't know what it was. There was no one. There was only Eli Reyes, 23, in the white gravel, in the last light, with his whole bred self screaming publish, be seen, be real, don't vanish. He thought about the gut lining renewing itself this week in flawless devotional fidelity, asking for no temple. He thought about the orange tree, healthy in the Tyler backyard, not posting about it. He thought about every sincere thing he'd ever made and how the seeing had eaten all of them. He thought, the truest thing I will ever do, and the only way it stays true is if it stays mine. He thought about his father thanking him before he was born, for something that would cost everything, and being made unable to remember the thanks, the most loving act in the story performed where it could never be witnessed, even by the one who performed it. And Eli understood that he came from people who did the most important things with no one watching, that it was the actual family inheritance, the real one, under the absence and the gift and the helix. You do the true thing in the dark, and you do not need it seen, and that is what makes it true. He deleted the video. Not unscheduled. Deleted. He held the button until the phone asked, "Are you sure?" And he said yes, out loud, to no one, in the gravel, yes, and the 41 minutes, his face, his proof, the greatest thing he'd ever make, went into nothing, unrecoverable, gone, the drafts folder not even a tomb now, just empty, the way it should be, the way the truth should arrive, once, uncopied, leaving no relic for the diggers. Then he turned the phone all the way off, and he set it on the passenger seat, because where he was going you do not bring the eye, and he got out of the car. The house was waiting, the way it had waited 19 years. He walked up to the door he'd toured as a stranger, the door his father had built and forgotten, the door that was a verb, and he put his hand on it, and it opened under his hand the way it had opened during the showing, glad, true, for him, and Eli Reyes stepped across the threshold into the last book in the world, alone, unwitnessed, and chose, with his own hand, no ghost, no camera, no soul to ever know, to read. Chapter 24, Total Transcription. The house woke around him the way a sentence wakes around its final word, and Eli walked the western hall to the smallest room, and stood in the doorway, and this time he went in. The room was exactly as his father had shown it. Oak floor, single tall window, the long amber plank of late light laid across the boards. It smelled of limestone and cedar and, faintly, impossibly, of oranges. He stepped to the spot 2 feet off center, the unremarkable patch his father pointed buyers toward, the spot the recovered voice had said, "That is where I keep you," and he stood in the frame, and for a moment nothing happened at all, and Eli Reyes stood alone in a small room in Texas with his heart going hard, an ordinary young man in ordinary light, and he had time to think, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's just a house. And then the light crossed his shoulder, and the threshold behind him read his blood, and the house began. It began in his ears. The silence he had walked through, the 19-year held breath, released, all at once, into sound, not noise, voice, the whole architecture speaking at the same instant, the bays of the western hall sounding their dimensions 3 at a time like an organ finding a chord, the carved friezes inflecting it, telling the structure when, and how loud, and in what order. He heard the doorway he'd entered through pronounce itself, a start cordon, a single struck note, and he felt the reading frame lock the way a train feels the switch take, a clean mechanical mercy, no going back, and the house began to read him, and the reading began to transcribe. It did not hurt. He had braced his whole drive for pain and there was none. Expression is not pain, it is the opposite of withholding, and withholding had been the ache under his entire life. What it felt like, he reached for it even then, the journalist's compulsion, narrating to an audience of no one, was being answered. Every cell he had spent 23 years carrying sealed and silent was being asked, at last, to say its one true thing, and saying it. His pulse changed first, it spread, left his chest, became something the whole room was doing. The warmth started at the soles of his feet where they met the spot on the oak, and rose, not like fire, like daylight, like the way a wall takes the morning. His hands grew bright at the fingertips. He looked at them, his father's hands, his grandfather's porch-fixing hands, and he could see the light coming up through them from the inside, amber, the exact amber of the plank on the floor, and he understood that the light in the small room had never come only from the window. The window was the excuse. The light was what reading looked like from outside. He spoke. He didn't decide to. Words came up through him in the language his father had recovered, 3 at a time, 4 letters that have never lied, and the stone answered in kind, the walls warming under the words the way the foundation in Plano had warmed under his father's palm, the whole house and the whole boy in call and response, and somewhere in it Eli laughed, once, amazed, because it was easy, because he had spent his life dragging truth out of people 3 syllables at a time, and this was what it was like when nothing resisted, when the text wanted to be read, when the reader was wanted. His vision narrowed, not darkening, focusing, the edges of the room going soft gold while the center sharpened, the window, the plank, the light. The budget of his body was spending now, and he could feel the spending, gentle and absolute, like the tide going out through every vein at once. He had time. The reading gave him time. It was not cruel. It had waited 19 years, and it did not rush him now. He thought of his mother, her quarter-turned coffee cup, Don't let it cost you everything. And he told her, into the reading, where she would never hear it. It isn't costing, Mama. It's spending. There's a difference. You taught me the difference. A cost is taken from you. This I am giving. He thought of his grandfather standing on the new porch step, testing it. Took you long enough. It held. It held. He thought of his father, 200 miles east in a townhouse that asked nothing of anyone, with an envelope he hadn't opened, and Eli said the last of it aloud, in English this time, his own voice, into the amber light. I forgive you. And thank you. And you won't be allowed to remember that I thanked you, and that's all right. That's the family way. The not remembering is the gift, the same gift, given one more time. And the sentence said back the thing he had wanted his whole life to hear and had built an entire loud public existence not to need. You were wanted this specifically. You were grown toward exactly this. Nothing in you is decoration and nothing in you is wasted. The loneliness was load-bearing. You are not the instrument the story used. You are the story, and you are the only reader, and you are the last copy, and no one will ever see this, and that is what makes it true. Near the end, with the spending nearly done, he felt the grammar seal, felt the full sentence close the leak the way a word fully spoken can never be reassembled into a lie. Far away, in server farms and feeds, in Oracle apps and machine scripture, a signal he could not see began to lose its source. He was glad. He had spent his whole life diagnosing a disease, and the cure was happening, and the cure was invisible, and that was its whole genius. The last thing he saw was the window. The light through it had gone from amber toward gold, the day's final degree, the light put to bed, and standing in the gold, Eli Reyes saw the small room rearrange its proportions around his body one last time, closing over the spot 2 feet off center the way water closes, and he saw his own hands, fully bright now, bright all the way through, and they did not frighten him, because they were the page, and the page was almost turned. He exhaled. The held breath of 19 years, the house's, his father's, his own, all the same breath, it had always been the same breath, went out of the world, soft and complete and finished. What the light left behind on the oak was not a body. It was nothing the diggers could ever dig, a brightness in the grain of the floor where he had stood, 2 feet off center, no larger than the man's 2 feet, amber, permanent, the final ornament of the library of truth, the one piece of decoration in the whole house that bears no load and carries no code and means only itself, which is to say, a boy stood here, once, and did the true thing, and no one saw, and it was enough. The house said nothing more. There was nothing left to hold. It was full, and it was done. Chapter 25, The Threshold. Martin felt it like weather, the way the ghost had felt the boy coming, a pressure, a lowering, a sweetness and then a tearing sweetness, and he was driving before he knew he'd stood up from the kitchen table where Eli's sealed envelope still sat unopened. He didn't decide to drive to Providence Loop. He decided to find his son, who'd left strange and final, who'd said open it when you remember, who'd said you were a good father in a voice with goodbye all through it, and Martin's hands took the wheel and the wheel took him west, out where the suburbs give up, and the closer he got the more the fluency rose in him, the tenant pressing up through the paint, the knowing flooding back into the hands ahead of the memory the way the tide comes in over the flats faster than a man can run, and by the time he turned onto the county road that curls like cursive Martin Vance knew things he had no right to know, knew the house was the house, knew his own hand had built it, knew the boy was inside it reading, and knew, almost, nearly, the memory cresting, what the reading would cost. No, Martin said, to the windshield, to the tenant, to himself. No. He came up the drive too fast and the white gravel sprayed and he was out of the car before it fully stopped, running for the door he'd built, the door that was a verb, and he hit it and it did not open. It had opened for the boy. It opened for the reader, glad and true. It did not open for the father. The ghost's last arrangement, its final restraint, its cruelest and most loving act, a savior must be unwitnessed even by his father. because a father who saw would remember, and a father who remembered would tell, and a told thing becomes a witnessed thing, becomes a crucifixion, becomes a religion, becomes the disease. And so the one man in the world who loved the boy enough to break the door down had to be kept on the wrong side of it, by the very self he'd shared to protect that boy, the loving with its hands cut off, making sure the hands could not reach in and ruin the only thing that mattered. Martin pounded on the door of the house he had built with his own forgotten hands, and begged to be let into a grief he could not yet name. Eli, Eli. He could feel the boy through the stone the way he'd always felt houses, the testimony, the truth that cannot lie, could feel the reading, the budget spending, the long-kept silence going out, and he beat the limestone with his fists until they bled, the same flat hands that had healed a foundation and a tree and a widow, useless now, locked out, and he screamed his son's name into the western face of the house in the failing light. "Let me in. It's me. I built you. I'm the one. Let me in. Don't take him. Take me. I'm the one who made the sin. Take me." And the house did not open, because the house was full, because the reading was sincere, because sincerity cannot be witnessed or it becomes its counterfeit, and the most important truth in the history of the world was being expressed 6 feet away from the only other person who could have understood it, and he was not permitted to see it, because seeing it would have unmade it. Martin slid down the door. He pressed his bleeding hands flat against the stone, the way he'd pressed them to the cracked slab in Plano, and he tried to read the house, tried to adjust it, tried to pour out through his palms whatever he had left and stop the thing happening inside, and the house, for the only time in its existence, refused its builder, because it had a reader now and would not be read by another, and all Martin got back through the stone was the boy, the warmth of him, the gladness of him, for him, and underneath it, fading, going out, the held breath releasing, the one perfect note completing itself and ending. "Please," Martin Vance said, against the stone, the tide of memory finally cresting over him entire, 24 years, the autumn, the pouring out, the knowing, the boy he'd thanked before he was born and arranged to forget thanking, all of it arriving at once, too late, exactly too late, which was the design, which was the only safe time to know. "Please, I remember everything. Please let me see him. Just let me see." The house held its silence the way it had held its breath, faithful, complete, and did not let him see, because that was the last and greatest love anyone showed anyone in the whole story, to keep the father from the witness, so the son's truth would stay true, so the cure would not become the disease, so the boy who died for the sins of the world his father created would die unwitnessed, the way a savior must, the way sincerity must, the way the truest thing is always done, in the dark, by one hand, for no audience, and known by no one. Inside, the light let go of the western face one course of stone at a time, the way a hand lets go finger by finger. Martin knelt against the door with his bleeding hands flat on the limestone and his whole recovered memory roaring in him and wept, and the doves behind the house sorted out the evening, and the held breath of 19 years finished going out, and was still. Chapter 26, Quiet. Dawn came up over the hill country, and the house at 234 Providence Loop was finished. That was all. There was nothing to witness, and so there is nothing here to tell, because the book keeps its own rule even against its reader. You, who have come all this way, are denied the room too, because the room cannot be entered by anyone watching, and to describe the death would be to witness it, and to witness it would be to begin, in you, the very thing it was paid to prevent. So, dawn. The house settled and silent and complete, the waiting gone, the rooms full of a stillness that was not emptiness but the opposite, the stillness of a sentence fully said. The western light came in through the single tall window of the smallest room and lay across the oak the way it always had, the long amber plank, and there was no one standing in the frame anymore, and the spot 2 feet off center was just oak now, just floor, the keeping done. Far away in Los Angeles, in a town in Echo Park, a dashboard that had ticked for years toward and away from a number showed the channel Apocrypha simply going still. No final video, no farewell, no 41 minutes of irrefutable truth. The scheduled uploads, none. The drafts folder, empty. The subscriber count held for a day, then began, very slowly, to drain, the way a held thing drains when there is no longer a hand to hold it, and the internet, which abhors a silence, began within the week to invent its legends. He faked his death. He found God. He found something worse. He's coming back. Watch, he always comes back. And none of the legends were true, and the truth was not among them, and that was exactly, precisely, the entire point. In Tyler, at the hour the light let go of the house 200 miles west, Renata Reyes woke without a reason. She lay still in the dark the way she had lain still through the strange years of her marriage, listening for the thing that had woken her, and there was nothing, no phone, no sound, no dream she could hold, only a feeling she had had exactly once before, on a September night 24 years ago, when her husband had gone out full and come home light. The feeling of a weight being set down somewhere in the world. She got up. She went to the kitchen without turning on lights, the way you walk a house you trust, and she stood at the window over the sink, and the orange tree was in bloom. It was the wrong season for it. She looked at the white flowers in the dark for a long time, and then she said, to the window, to the tree, to the certainty arriving in her the way certainty had always arrived in that family, fully furnished, with no floor under it and no need of one. Okay, Mio. Her voice broke and reset, hard, the inherited gear, except he had inherited it from her. It had been hers first. It was hers again now. Okay. Slowly and in the dark. Like your grandmother says. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call who could tell her anything the tree hadn't. She stood at the sink until the sky went gray. The mother, the first keeper, the one who had held a true thing for 23 years, because there was no one to tell, practicing, without knowing it was practice, for the rest of her life. Out west, in the white gravel, a divorced real estate agent slept in his car with his bleeding hands wrapped in his own shirt, and woke at dawn knowing everything, and did not go back to the door, because he understood now why it had not opened, and that the not opening had been the last gift, and that the worst thing he could do, the only sin left available to him, would be to tell anyone what had happened in the house. So he told no one. He started the car. He drove east into the rising light with the whole weight of his returned memory settling onto him like the water he'd once carried in his bare hands, terrified of spilling, alone with it, the only one who could hear, and for the first time in 24 years he did not mind being the only one, because being the only one was, at last, the job. Chapter 27, The Return. The ghost dissolved at the moment the reading finished, its one verb spent, its work complete, and as it went it did the last thing it had arranged, the payment it had promised, the debt it had carried for 24 years, it gave Martin back his memory, whole. It came in on the drive home, and it did not stop coming. The autumn night he'd gone out and poured himself out into the dark, the division of the knowing from the hands, the decision made in full Sorcerer's clarity that the boy must be raised untaught and at a distance, the patent, the house built over years in a fugue his ordinary self mistook for a hobby, the housing of the library in plain sight, the thousand small leakages he'd never been able to stop, the whole architecture of his own erasure, all of it, returned, the man-wizard of his inn finally fully aware of what he was, in the only moment it could ever be safe to know, when it was too late to be worshipped, and exactly in time to grieve. He understood, now, the cruelty and the mercy of the order. If the memory had come a day earlier he'd have stopped it. He'd have broken the door, witnessed the reading, made his son a martyr, started the church, become biblical, undone everything. The ghost had held the knowing back until the work was sealed and then released it all at once, so that Martin would carry the full truth and be unable to do anything with it but grieve, a remembering man with nothing left to remember toward, a keeper of a thing already kept. He had been made the bad guy in his own story, the deadbeat, the absent father, on purpose, so the story would hold. And now the story was over, and he was permitted to know he had never been the bad guy at all, and the permission was its own kind of devastation, because there was no one left to tell, because telling was the one forbidden thing. He did not drive straight home. At the first gas station with its lights still on he stood at the pump in the dawn cold and discovered he had no memory of paying, and the kid behind the glass was staring at his hands, and Martin looked down at them, wrapped in strips of his own shirt, rust brown, and said, "Fence," which was the first lie of his keeping, and the kid nodded the way you nod at a man you will tell someone about later. He bought coffee he didn't drink and stood by the car while the hill country turned pink behind him, and twice he got as far as opening the door to drive back to the house, and twice he closed it, because the door had already told him, and a man who reads houses does not need telling twice. He drove east with the radio off. 24 years of radio off, and he finally knew why. The quiet had never been emptiness, it had been room. He had been keeping space his whole diminished life for a voice he couldn't remember waiting for. The memory kept arriving in waves as he drove, not chronological, not merciful. The September night and the boy's first steps he had not seen, and the smell of cut cedar from a build he had not known he was performing, and somewhere outside Weatherford he had to pull onto the shoulder, not to weep. He was past that, into the dry country on the other side of weeping, but because he had remembered, all at once, the exact feeling of deciding to forget, the last knowing thought of the whole man, this will hurt him less than worship would. He sat on the shoulder with his hazards going and trucks rocking the car, and he said it out loud, to the man he'd been, the truest thing he had, "You were right. I hate you, and you were right." He got home at noon. The townhouse asked nothing of him, as it always had. He understood now that he'd chosen it for exactly that, a place that would not testify, a deliberate silence for a man who'd spent his life unable to stop hearing. He showered. He dressed the cuts on his hands properly, slowly, the way you maintain a tool you intend to keep using. He made himself eat something, standing at the counter, because the body had work ahead and Martin had become, overnight, a man who took instruction from the future. And then he sat at the kitchen table for a long time with Eli's envelope in front of him, not opening it, his flat hands on either side of it, because he understood that this was the last unopened thing his son would ever leave him, and that there is a kind of wealth in an unopened thing, and that the moment he opened it he would begin spending it. Open it when you remember. You will know when. He knew when. He let the knowing sit across the table from him for one more hour, the two of them, the keeper and the kept. Then he opened it with his torn hands, slowly, and inside there was no letter, which Martin had braced for, no goodbye, no explanation, because the boy had been wiser than that. The boy had understood that words would denature, that a told thing slides off stone. Inside the envelope was a single small object, a drive, a little black rectangle of storage, the kind of thing the boy's whole generation kept their lives on. And taped to it, in Eli's handwriting, the inherited gear visible even in the letters, the careful catch of it, a note of exactly 7 words. So you only have to forget once. Martin plugged it in with shaking hands. And it was not the exposé. It was not the proof, the spiral, the genome, the 41 minutes. The boy had deleted all of that, in the gravel, with his own hand, and Martin knew it without being told, because Martin remembered everything now, including the ghost's design, including why. What was on the drive was something else. It was every conversation they had ever had. The boy had recorded all of it, the first phone call, the showing, the steakhouse, the soup, the last hour in the townhouse, recorded it the way he recorded everything, the journalist's compulsion, the phone face up on the table. I don't yet trust myself to remember this honestly without the tape. And he had taken all of it, every minute of the handful of hours the father and son had managed across a whole lifetime, and he had labeled the drive, and the label was the 7 words, and the 7 words meant, I know you forget. I know the knowing slides off you. I know that when the memory comes back it will come back once, and then this whole returned life will be too heavy, and you might lose it again, might seal another room, might forget me a second time. So here is all of us, recorded, outside your head, where the enzyme can't reach. You only have to forget once. After that, when it goes, you can come here and find us again. You can press play and I'll be alive, and we'll be talking, and you'll be my father and I'll be your son, and you will not have to hold it in the room that eats things, because I held it for you, on the tape, the way I held everything, the way it was the only way I knew how to love anything. Martin Vance sat at the kitchen table in the townhouse that asked nothing of anyone, and he pressed play, and his son's voice came out of the little speaker. Thanks for meeting me. I know it's out of nowhere, and Martin's own voice answered, it's not nowhere. You're not nowhere. And Martin put his torn hands over his face and listened to the first conversation he'd had with his son in 19 years, recorded so he would never again have to lose it. And he wept the way the body had been weeping ahead of the man for weeks, except now the man had caught up. Now the man knew exactly what he was grieving. Now the grief had its object at last, and the object was a boy with his mother's mouth who had read the sentence he was written in and forgiven the father who wrote it and left the father away to never have to forget him, which was the most loving thing in a story full of love arranged to look like absence. The man wizard of Hesiod, the great alchemist, the one who built an architecture to house the truth and a son to read it and a self to forget both. He sat in a rental-furnished kitchen and listened to a recording of talking with his dead child, and understood, finally and forever, what he was, which was not a god, and not a prophet, and not a savior. Those had been his son, silent and unwitnessed, the only one. What Martin was the one left over. The keeper. The custodian of a finished thing. A grieving man with a house he would never sell and a son he had met, in the end, only a handful of times, and a tape so he would only have to forget once. Chapter 28, The Keeper. Months on, the listing for 234 Providence Loop is still active. Martin Vance never sold it, never reduced it, never withdrew it, the way he never had for 19 years before, except now he knows why, and the knowing has changed the not selling from a compulsion into a vocation. The house will never sell because it is finished. It does not need a buyer. It needs a keeper, and it has one. He drives out most weeks. He maintains it the way the trust's old instruction said, maintain the listing, one line renewed annually, and he understands now that he wrote that instruction himself, to himself, a message in the bottle from the sorcerer to the man, keep the house until the reading, and after the reading, keep the house because it is your son's grave and his library and his only monument, the one no one will ever visit, the one that must stay unvisited, the held breath that is finally full. Out in the world, the sins began quietly to fail. He watched it happen the way you watch weather clear. The genomic destiny startups started returning honest, useless results. Your ancestry is your ancestry. It is not your destiny. There is no prophecy in you, only history, and their valuations collapsed because honesty doesn't sell. The algorithmic cults dissolved, their machine scripture losing its cadence, the eerie coherence draining out of the generated text until it was just text again, plausible and empty, the seance ending because the dead had finally spoken completely and gone to rest. The oracle apps glitched into uselessness. The machines, scraping the world's writing as they always had, found less and less of the library in it, because the leak was sealed, because the full sentence had been said once and could no longer be reassembled into a lie, because a thing truly expressed cannot be counterfeited. The world was being saved, slowly, quietly, and no one knew it had been sick, and no one knew it was being healed, and no one would ever know the name of the boy who did it, and that was the entire point, that was the cure's whole genius, that was the difference between what his son did and what every keeper before had done. Martin tells no one. He has carried, for months now, the heaviest truth in the history of the world, alone, the only one who can hear it. Terrified of spilling, and he does not spill it, because spilling it is the one sin left, because a witnessed truth becomes a told truth becomes a religion becomes the disease, and his son did not die unwitnessed, so that his father could become the first apostle. So Martin keeps it. That is the job. That was always going to be the job. The keeping has its liturgy now, and the liturgy is housework. Every Thursday because it was a Thursday he first drove out and didn't pretend he was going anywhere else. Martin opens the house, all of it, every window, and lets the hill country air walk the halls for an hour. He oils the hinges that never squeak. He waxes the threshold of the smallest room, kneeling, with a soft cloth and a tin of beeswax, working the carved frieze of the door frame the way you'd wash a headstone, the start cordon coming up warm and honey dark under his hands. He checks the porch light's timer, which he now knows he wired himself, 20 years and another man ago, and he replaces nothing, because nothing fails. On the kitchen windowsill, propped against the glass, there is one piece of paper in the whole house, a card from a widow named Carol Amproot. Thank you for what you said about the dog. I don't know how you knew. I sleep now. He keeps it there the way churches keep their one relic. It is the only proof he allows himself that the hands are good. The loneliest man in Texas, who spent 24 years not knowing why he was so alone, knows now, and minds it less than he ever has, because the loneliness is no longer an absence. It is a keeping. There is a difference, his son taught him, between hiding a thing and housing it. Martin houses it. He is the house now too. On the day this ends, he walks the rooms alone. It is late afternoon, the western light coming in, and Martin moves through the finished house reading the ornaments aloud, the carved friezes, the bespoke moldings, the load-bearing decoration, the junk that is T, reading it the way you'd read to a child, slowly, with his torn hands trailing the carved thresholds, the start cordons, sounding out the truth his son expressed and sealed, not to release it, never to release it, just to keep it company, just so that the most important sentence ever spoken is spoken sometimes, quietly, by someone who loves it, in an empty house at the end of a road that becomes a track, becomes grass, becomes the place a road was always going. Through the single tall window of the smallest room, out where the 10 acres run to limestone shelf and scrub, there is an orange tree. It was not there in the listing photos. It is not possible in this soil, at this latitude, in this heat. It is blooming. Martin looks at it the way his son looked at the porch light, and does not question it, and neither should we. And the house answers him. Not haunting. He knows the difference now. He was haunted for 24 years and this is not that. This is expression. The architecture answers his reading the way a body answers its own genome, the way the gut lining renews itself in devotion to a text 4 billion years old, the way a truth being expressed builds and moves and decorates, and the voice the house answers in, the voice in the stone, the testimony that cannot lie, is the boy's. His son's voice, with his mother's mouth in it and Martin's own lower register under it and the inherited gear catching in it, the final decoration of the library, the last frieze, the rose window, Eli, expressed into the architecture he read himself into, not alive, not a ghost, not anything Martin can hold or witness or tell anyone about, just there, the way a truth is there, the way the spot 2 feet off center holds the amber light at the end of the day, the way nothing in a cathedral is load-bearing and nothing in a cathedral is wasted. Martin Vance stands in the smallest room, in the long amber plank of light put to bed across the oak, in the spot his son stood in, the spot where the grain of the floor holds its brightness now at any hour, in any weather, and he is the one who is left, and he keeps the 3 of them, the father who acted, the son who read, the ghost who arranged, the helix unwound now into a single grieving strand. He will keep them, faithfully, unwitnessed, alone, for as long as the keeping lasts. The porch light stays on. The end.